90s kid forever, baby. So this is a long video. There's no way around that. And I know there's nothing more annoying than having to scroll through the timeline of a 4-hour long video to see if it actually has what you're looking for. So before we go any further, here's a review of what's covered in this video. The basic skeleton for creating a WordPress plugin in general, how to create a settings page for your plugin that saves user preferences into the database using the Settings API. We'll learn a bit about localization, or how to make your plugin easy to translate into other languages. We'll learn how to use JavaScript to create Gutenberg or block editor block types. We'll learn how to use React.js and JSX in those block types. We'll learn how to use the official WordPress NPM workflow package that makes working with React and JSX a piece of cake. We'll spend the time to truly understand how WordPress saves the data for each instance of a block into the database. We'll learn how you can use PHP if you want to make your block types truly dynamic. And finally, we'll talk about when it makes sense to use custom post types to store data for your plugin versus when it's a good idea to instead create your own custom database table. So that's what's included in this 4-hour video, but all of this is just an excerpt from 10+ hours of new lessons I just added to my premium WordPress development course. In the full course, we learn even more about plugin development, including how to set up your own admin sidebar menu with your own custom SVG icon, 16 lessons where we build 2 super custom Gutenberg block types together. One is a multiple choice quiz block type that uses React even on the public front end, and the other is called Featured Professor, and it lets you pull in dynamic content from a different blog post just by storing a piece of metadata with the ID of that post. This allows us to create a 2-way relationship between the blog post and the featured professor. And even though I'm a huge fan of the plugin called Advanced Custom Fields, I think it's super empowering to be able to create relationships between different posts on our own without having to rely on any other plugin. And finally, in the full course, there are 4 extra lessons at the very end where we do actually go ahead and create our own custom database table and practice writing our own SQL statements. So, if you work through this video and you're still interested and you want to learn more, you can find a super discounted coupon in the description for this video to join my full course at the best price. Having said all of that, I hope this video helps you on your WordPress, your PHP, and your JavaScript journey. Now, enjoy the actual video. Hello everyone. In this video, we're starting a new 3-chapter section of the course that is all about plugin development. Without further ado, let's review what these 3 new chapters are going to be about. So the first chapter will be about PHP. This will cover sort of the traditional skeleton or building blocks of creating a new plugin. The next chapter will be about JavaScript. So we'll create a new block type for the WordPress or Gutenberg block editor. Along the way, we'll learn a little bit about React, but we need to remember that this is a course about WordPress, not React. Meaning we won't cover React as in-depth and as slow of a pace as we would in my course that's entirely dedicated to React. Okay, and then in the final of these 3 plugin chapters, we'll talk about databases. Specifically, when your plugin needs to store data, we'll talk about when it makes sense to use the WordPress built-in custom post type versus when it makes more sense to use or create your own custom database table. So that's an overview of the 3 chapters, but if you're anything like me, topics or keywords like this aren't that useful. And instead, I prefer to see the real-world result of what we're going to create. So right now, let's look at a quick preview, take a quick look at the finished product of what we're going to build together. So if I visit the blog section of my website and then view the permalink or single view for a post, you can see there's this area called Post Statistics, and it says how many words the post has, how many characters, and about how long it would take to read the post. So this area of content is dynamically being added to this blog post through a plugin. Now let's go into the admin dashboard and look at the settings screen that we'll build for this particular plugin. So under the settings menu in the sidebar, we see this brand new area called word count. If we click on that, we have different options. So you can say if you want the post statistics to be at the beginning or the end of the post. You can change the statistics headline text to be whatever you want. And then you can also check or uncheck which one of these pieces of content you want to include. Okay, so that's the first example plugin that we're going to create together. Let's change gears and look at the second example plugin that we'll create together. So in the admin sidebar, you'll see an entirely new section called Word Filter. It has its own custom icon, and it actually has its own sub-menu with 2 different pages. Let's look at the first page, or just the words list. So here you can include a comma-separated list of words that you don't want to show up on your website or in your blog post content. So for example, if I want to filter out ipsum, right, the second word in lorem ipsum, and then comma, maybe the word tempore. Okay, and then I'll click Save Changes. And then if I go back to the front end of my website, here's a blog post, and if I refresh, notice it filtered out the word ipsum that would have been here and the word tempore that would have been here. Now in terms of what we want this replaced bit of content to be, well, in the sidebar, the submenu for this new plugin, you can click on Options. You could have included this on the previous page, but this is just going to be an example of how to have sub-pages or a sub-menu. So this can be anything you want as the replacement text, or you can just leave it blank and that will entirely remove those filtered words from your content. Okay, so those 2 example plugins that we just looked at, those will be in the first chapter about PHP and just sort of traditional plugin development. Now let's change gears though and talk about the second chapter, which is going to be about JavaScript. In particular, we're going to create a new block type. So let me go edit this post. It's called a new sample post. So if I go into posts, a new sample post. Okay, and let's imagine that maybe after this first paragraph, I want to add a new block. I can use this button. And here we see 2 new block types that you're not used to seeing. Quick question and professor callout. So we're going to build both of these together. Let's start with quick question. So if I click on that, you can ask the viewers of your website a question to make sure that they're paying attention. So we could say, what color is the sky on a clear and sunny day? And then you give it multiple options or answers. So we could say orange, add another answer, green, add another answer, blue. And then I'm not sure if you can see it, but there are yellow star outlines, and that's how you can mark which answer is the correct answer. So I'll star the blue answer. Okay, let me go ahead and save or update this post, and then let's view this on the front end of our website. So if I refresh the front end after the first paragraph, cool. And now if I get this question wrong on purpose as a viewer of the article, you can see, sorry, try again. But if I get it correct, that's correct. Cool, and then when it fades back, you can see it sort of lets you know which answers are wrong and marks the correct answer with a green check mark. Also, by default, notice this block has a gray background color. But if we go back into the admin or the edit screen, if I open up the right-hand sidebar, with this block selected, you can choose any color you want. So maybe I'll give it a really sort of light green color. Click Update, refresh on the front end, you can see that's reflected. Cool, so that's the first block type that we'll create together using JavaScript and React and working with the Gutenberg system in WordPress. Let's change gears and look at the second block type that we'll create together. So let me scroll down a bit here. Maybe after this paragraph, I want to show you the next block type. So I'll add this, and it's called Professor Callout. Let's click that, and then you can select a professor that you want to highlight or feature in this blog post. So I'll say Dr. Barks a lot. And now here's the cool part. This is pulling in the real data for Dr. Barks a lot on the fly. So if I save this, this is not hard-coded content that's getting injected into this blog post. Instead, if we ever update the Dr. Barks a lot post in the future, this content within the blog post will automatically get updated. This is made possible by learning how to leverage metadata or post meta. So instead of using something like advanced custom fields, we can roll up our sleeves and create our own custom solution where you can store a relationship between different pieces of content. Anyways, we'll talk more about this when we actually build this feature, but back on the front end, if I refresh, now you can see below that paragraph, there's a call out to Dr. Barksalot. And then if you visit Dr. Barksalot's page, we can show the relationship coming from the other direction, right? So the plugin dynamically adds this little piece of content to the professor permalink, and it's going to find any blog posts that have a relationship with this professor. Okay, once we finish that plugin together, that will wrap up the JavaScript chapter. Now let's change gears and talk about the plugin database chapter. So in this chapter, we're going to add a new section to our website called Pet Adoption. In the Pet Adoption section, you can see there's going to be 100,000 randomly generated pets. So 100,000 items that need to be stored in the database somewhere. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see what's going on. So each pet will have a randomly generated name, species, weight, birth year, hobby, favorite color, and favorite food. Now right about here, you can see how long it took for WordPress to create this page. So if I refresh, every time it's going to be slightly different. But you can see that on average on my computer, it's taking about 0.2 of a second to load the first 100 pets out of the 100,000 items. Now that's not too bad of a speed. However, it gets a lot worse. So this is just a generic query to show us any and all pets. What if instead I only want to see the pets that are of the species cat and only cats that have a favorite hobby of scratching furniture? So if I go up into the address bar and add on $species equals cat and fave hobby equals scratching furniture. Let me scroll down a little bit. So you can see out of the 100,000 pets, there are 805 that match that specific search. However, that took almost a full second to complete. Let me refresh again so we can see sort of an average speed. That took 1.1 seconds. Everything's subjective, but I feel like that's very slow. Now this example that we're looking at right now, this is using custom post types to store the pet data. So each one of these 100,000 pets is a post, right, of the custom post type called pet. And then each one of these custom pieces of data about the pet, that's a piece of meta. Now, when we actually get to this chapter, we'll discuss this in greater detail, but essentially, there are many things that you get for free when you use WordPress custom post types. Every developer has a different opinion, but I believe custom post types are a great idea unless you need to be able to search or query by a piece of metadata. At that point, it gets very inefficient and very slow. Because, for example, in this tab, we have the exact same 100,000 pets, only now we're no longer using custom post types. In this tab on this site, in this example, I've created my own separate custom database table, and I'm writing my own SQL queries. So if I perform the same search, right, if I say only show me where species equals cat and fave hobby equals scratching furniture, you can see if I refresh, that's only taking about 1/10 of a second compared to over 1.1 seconds using the WordPress custom post type solution. So that's somewhere in the ballpark of 10 times faster. Anyways, in this chapter, we'll discuss in detail when it makes sense to use custom post types for your plugin data needs and when it makes sense to implement your own custom database table like this. We'll also learn how to have this red X to the side so you can delete any one of the pet items. Also, down at the very bottom of this page, there's a form where you can add in a name and then it will randomly generate all of the other attributes about the pet and add it to the database so that we can practice sort of the basics of CRUD operations using your own custom database table. Okay, so that wraps up the quick preview or the quick look at the finished product of what we're going to build together. At this point, you might be thinking to yourself, but what about topics or features X, Y, and Z in WordPress, like widgets or any of the other 10,000 features in WordPress? Well, these 3 chapters of the course, they're meant to be a guided tour, not an exhaustive encyclopedia of plugin development. WordPress is just too big of a topic with too many different features and APIs, and sort of the whole point of plugins is that the possibilities are infinite, endless. Anything that you can think of that you want to extend or customize in WordPress, you can do that with a plugin. So every single option, every parameter, every action or every filter that we can hook onto, any setting that we can change. Anything is possible with plugins. So it's impossible to cover it all in a course like this. Trust me, the course would become 400 hours long and everyone would lose interest. The idea here is just to show you the core basic building blocks and the most common features that you're going to need to work with in order to build plugins. From there, once you're familiar with these basics, it'll be easy for you to Google and do a bit of research on the specifics of a WordPress feature or API that you need to customize to bring your plugin idea to life. Okay, so the whole point of these 3 chapters is to give you a rock solid foundation to build upon. And I think it's going to be a ton of fun. Now, in our very next lesson, we're going to get started. We'll be starting with the traditional PHP chapter. So just sort of creating a new plugin, maybe creating an admin menu, so on and so forth. I'm excited to jump into this with you. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to create our first plugin. Now, before we worry about making our plugin do anything that's actually useful or complex, let's first just learn the basics of how and where to create a plugin in the first place. So in this video, let's imagine our goal is to create a plugin that dynamically adds an extra sentence at the end of a blog post detail screen. So if I go into this single post, so imagine we want our plugin to dynamically add an extra sentence at the end of a blog post. That's our goal in this video. Okay, and then once we're familiar with just creating a super basic plugin, then we can learn how to do actually useful things. So do this with me. Let's go create a new folder for a new plugin. At this point in the course, you know how to find the folder with your WordPress installation in it. So this would be where there's the folder called WP Content. Let's look inside WP Content, and then there will be a folder named Plugins. Let's go inside the Plugins folder. Okay, and then just create a brand new folder for this plugin that we're about to create. So new folder, you can name it whatever you'd like, but give it a unique name that you don't think any other plugin has ever used before. So for example, I will name it our first unique plugin. Okay, then go ahead and open this up in VS Code or your text editor of choice. Next, let's create a new PHP file in this folder. You can name this file after the folder name for your plugin. So for example, you could call it our first unique plugin.php. But it will also work if you just name this just about anything. You could name it test.php, but just as a best practice, you could give it a relevant name to your plugin folder as well. So that's what I'll go with. Now inside this file, let's open up PHP. And then right after that opening line, let's jump into a comment. So /*, and then down on a new line, you can close out of the comment with */. Now in between that, right about here, we can just start giving WordPress a little bit of info about our plugin. So we can say plugin name, and then you can name it whatever you want. Let's call it our test plugin. Now while this can be whatever you want, this does need to be exactly plugin name, right? This is an attribute that WordPress is looking for. We can also give it a quick description. A truly amazing plugin. We can say that it's version, let's go with 1.0. We can say who the author is. You can add a link to your website or the plugins website by saying author URI : and then just paste in a URL. Okay, and for now, that's all of the properties that we need. In the future, we'll learn about how to make our plugin easy to translate into other languages. And when we get to that, we will circle back and add a few additional properties in this comment section. For now, though, let's just go ahead and save this file. And then back in WordPress, if we go into the admin dashboard, and then in the sidebar, look for plugins. Well, now in this list of plugins, we see our test plugin. And there's the description, there's the version number, and there's the author. So, just like any other plugin, let's go ahead and activate it. Now, we activated our plugin, but our plugin doesn't do anything yet. So, let's actually add a bit of useful code now. So remember, in this video, we just want to dynamically add a sentence to the very end of a blog post for the permalink or single view of posts. So here's how we can do that. Right below this, let's add a filter. So add filter. Be sure to have a semicolon after we call that. And then we're just going to give it two arguments here. So a comma b as placeholders. The first argument, instead of this a placeholder, would be quotes, the underscore content. WordPress has all sorts of different filters that we can hook onto. This one is aptly named. I think you can guess what it's going to do. It's going to allow us to filter or change the content for a post. So for the second argument, we just give it a function. You could include an inline or anonymous function here, but instead, just to stay organized, right below this, we could create a named function. Give it whatever name you want. Let's go with add to end of post, parentheses, curly brackets. Now a quick note that I want to add about function names here is that you do want to choose function names that won't conflict with other plugins or even the core of WordPress itself. So for right now, be sure to choose a unique name. However, I do want to let you know that in a future lesson, I will show you how to use classes in PHP, and this will allow us to avoid that issue of having to choose super unique function names. But we need to learn how to walk before we can run, so we'll get to that later. Anyways, for now, let's adjust this line. So instead of B, we would just give it a reference to our function. So quotes, I named it add to end of post. You might have named it something different. Just make sure it lines up. Okay, now in our function definition, in these parentheses, we do want to receive a parameter. So let's say $content. Now inside the body of this function, we can use the incoming content, and we can use that to create a new string of text that we return. So for example, return. Now we don't want to return just literally the exact same version of the blog post content. Instead, we would want to return that plus, so we could use a period to concatenate on something else. And let's just add on a string of text, so quotes. And maybe let's add on an HTML paragraph that says, my name is Brad. You could use your name. Let's give this a save and test it out. So if I go back to the front end of my site and view a blog post detail screen, cool, down at the bottom we see my name is Brad. Now just to make it clear how this is working, if you removed $content and the dot here and you just returned that string of text, that's all you would see. So the idea is content is the content that's actually being stored in the database for that real blog post, and then you can use that to create whatever string you want to create. And then you just return that as a whole, and that's what WordPress is going to use when your front-end template calls the content. Let me put that back. Refresh. Cool. One last thing that I do want to cover in this video is what if we only wanted to add this extra sentence on a detail view for a blog post? For example, if you had other pages that use the content to display the content, maybe you don't want to use this filter everywhere. So a common technique here would just be to wrap this line within an if statement. So within our function, here's what I would do. Take this return line and cut it into your clipboard. And then I would just write an if statement. I would say if, parentheses, curly brackets. For the condition, I would say if is underscore single, parentheses to call it, and, so double ampersand, and only if this is the main query. So is main query, parentheses to call that. So this is just my way of saying only if you're on a single screen for a post, and only if it's the main query, because sometimes a template might load or loop through other secondary posts, maybe down in the footer or in the sidebar. So this is just saying only for the main or primary post for this URL. So in the if block, you could just paste back in your clipboard. And then if this is not true, we would just want to return content without manipulating it at all. Now we don't even really need an else block here. A function will end as soon as you return something. So if this is true, this will end from this return. So then below this if statement, we can just return $content, right? If this is not the case. So we can go ahead and save that, and it's going to work just the same. If you really wanted to be able to test things to see if that conditional logic is working, you could try, instead of is single, is page. So is single will work for any detail screen for any post type except for page and attachment. So if I say is page, this is going to be false. So if I refresh, we no longer see the bonus sentence. But if you went to a individual page, right? So if I went to the About Us page, now we do see my name is Brad. Cool. So really that's all a plugin is. You're leveraging the different action hooks and filter hooks that WordPress makes available to us. Trust me, there are so many different actions and filters that we can leverage that you can customize WordPress in just about any way you can imagine. This was just a quick example to get your first plugin up and running, but now that we're familiar with these basics, we can try to do something more useful. So, in our very next lesson, let's begin building the post statistics or word count plugin. Right, we saw this in the previous video where it shows you how many words the current post has, how many characters it has, and about how long it will take to read. I think building something a bit more useful and real world like this should be a lot of fun and should be a great learning experience. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to create an admin settings page. Let's jump right into the action. So this is a preview of the finished product of what we're trying to build right now. We want to create a plugin that shows the word count, character count, and the approximate read time for a post. However, a big part of what plugins do isn't just the feature that they bring to the table, but it's also letting the user adjust settings and preferences. So, for example, what if the owner of this site, they wanted the word count and they wanted the read time, but maybe they did not want the character count? Well, this is where a plugin settings screen or an admin settings screen comes into play. So again, this is a preview of the finished product that we're going to build together, but if I jump into the admin dashboard and look under settings, there's something called word count with various settings, and the site owner could just uncheck this box for character count, hit save changes, and if you refresh on the front end, we no longer see the character count. So all of that is to say that before we worry about actually counting the words and how long it would take to read and the character count, and even before we learn how to save the user's preferences into a database, let's first just worry about adding a settings or admin page at all. Right? So our very first task is simply to learn how to add a link in the admin settings menu to a new custom page that we are creating. So right now, let me switch over to this tab where I do not have the finished product, and we can start to move forward together. Let's pick up where we left off in the previous lesson. So we already had a new plugin folder opened up in VS Code. And inside our only file, let's keep the comment and the opening PHP tag, but everything below the comments, let's delete all of this and give ourselves a clean slate. Let's begin by adding an action. So add action, semicolon. The name of the action that we want to hook onto is admin_menu. And then the second argument is just a function that we give it. So we need to create a unique function name that hasn't been used by any other plugin or by WordPress itself. Now, a bit later in this video, once we've actually set up the settings page link, we can talk about PHP classes, and that will allow us to avoid this coming up with unique function names challenge. But for now, let's just come up with a unique name. Let's name it Our Plugin Settings Link. Okay, now let's create a function with that exact matching name. So function Our Plugin Settings Link, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and now inside the body of this function, what do we want to do? Well, remember, our goal right now is to add a new page or link inside the WordPress admin settings menu. Right? We want a new option to appear somewhere in here. So, within our new function, we would just say add underscore options underscore page. Be sure to include a semicolon. Okay, and now inside these parentheses, we need to give this 5 arguments. So I'll just include 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as placeholders. And now let's talk about what we need to include here. The first argument is the title of the page that we want to create. So for example, this would be used in the actual tab in your browser, just the overall document title. So why don't we say quotes, word count settings, okay? The second argument is the text or title for the page that will be used in the settings menu. Now you'll notice there's not very much horizontal space here to fit too many words. So maybe instead of word count settings, for this, let's just say word count. Okay, the third argument has to do with permissions or capabilities. So this is basically saying what capability does the user need to have in order to see this page. So this gets into user roles and permissions. Do you want only your admins to be able to see this page? Do you want your editors, your average users? It's up to you, but I just want sort of administrative users to see this page. So for this third argument, I'm going to say quotes, manage underscore options. So only if the current user has permissions to change options in WordPress should they be able to see this page. Okay, the fourth argument is sort of the slug or short name for this new page. And even if we're going to be using PHP classes a bit later in this video, we still need this short name or slug to be unique. Essentially, this is what will be used at the end of the URL for our new settings page. So why don't we just say maybe word count settings page. Okay, and then the fifth and final argument is just a function that we give it, and it will be that function's job to actually output the HTML content that we want on the new page. So for now, let's just make up a unique new function name. I will call it Our Settings Page HTML. Okay, and then let's just go create a function with that matching name. So function Our Settings Page HTML, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and then in this function, instead of actually returning with the keyword return and then a string of text, instead of that, here's what we're going to do. Right after this opening curly bracket here, let's drop out of PHP, and then right before this closing curly bracket here, let's drop back into PHP. So then right here, we can just include regular traditional HTML. Now a bit later, we can set up real HTML that will look nice, but for now, just as a quick test, let's say hello world from our new plugin. Let's give this a save and test it out. So within our admin dashboard, just hit reload or refresh, and then let's scroll down, look in the settings menu, and there we see word count. And if we click on it, there we see that HTML, hello world from our new plugin, and also notice up in the tab for your browser, you see the full title, right? Word count settings. Now, before we start to add a bit of real HTML here, let's first address the challenge of having to come up with super unique function names. Because I don't know about you, but having to come up with names like our plugin settings link and our settings page HTML, that's not an enjoyable process for me, right? Having to come up with these really long names to make sure that they're unique and that no other plugin and that WordPress itself isn't already using it, that can be a time waster, and also it's just difficult to keep typing these names out throughout your code. It would be nice if we could use names for our functions that are a lot simpler. So this is where PHP classes can help us out. So let me show you what I would do. Right above this first add action line, so just right below the comments, let's add a new line and say class, that's lowercase, and then we make up a name. Now the class name does need to be unique itself, but the nice thing is that inside the class, none of the properties or methods need to have unique names. We'll see this in just a moment, but let's come up with a class name. How about word count and time plugin? Okay, now when you're creating a class, you do not have parentheses right after this like you would with a function. Instead, we just begin with curly brackets. Let's drop down. Okay, now inside here, this is where we sort of create a blueprint for an object. Okay, but then below this, we would want to instantiate or create a new instance of this class. So just right here below the curly brackets, let's say new instance of word count and time plugin, in parentheses to actually use the class, semicolon as well. Now this would work with the new object just sort of floating in outer space, but let me show you what I like to do. At the very beginning of this line, let's create a new variable, and let's just name it this exact same thing, but start it with a lowercase letter. So word count and time plugin equals. So $sign for a variable. This way, if any other plugins need to remove one of our actions or filters, they can actually get access to our functions or methods that live inside our class. Right? They could use this variable and then look inside it. At this point, let's circle back to what should go inside our actual class right here. So in PHP, anytime you create a new instance from a class, PHP will automatically call the function inside the class that is named __ construct. So let's create that function right now. So inside this class, function __ construct, parentheses, curly brackets. And now there's no one right or wrong way to set up a class, but what I like to do is include any of sort of the top level actions or filters that we're adding. I like to include those in the constructor. So let's just cut and paste this add action line. Let's cut this to live inside our new construct function. So right here. Okay, so now when we create our new instance from this blueprint, this code will automatically run. So now it's just a matter of moving our other functions to live inside our class. So just select or cut and paste these two functions. Cut those, and now just add them right after the constructor, right? So right after this function, but still in the class. So paste right here. Okay, and now we can sort of circle back to the whole reason we're even setting up a class in the first place. Now we can have a very simple name for this. So instead of this really long name of our plugin settings link, imagine if instead we just wanted this function to be named admin page. So we can just change that here, admin page. Okay, and now the question is, how do you reference that up here? It's not as simple as just changing this to admin page. Instead, we need to use the callable syntax in PHP. So here's what we do. Get rid of this second argument here entirely, and in its place, we give it an array. So array, parentheses, and we're going to give the array two arguments. So a comma b as a placeholder. The first argument is an object. So in this case, we just want to point towards this class itself, or this current instance of the class. So we'd say $this. Okay, and then the second argument is just the actual name of your method. So that would be quotes, admin page. Now the whole idea here is that you can name this something very generic. You don't need to worry about this creating a conflict with other plugins or with WordPress. So we can name this something short, generic, easy to type. We don't need to worry about that conflict issue. Let's do the same thing with this function. Why don't we change its name to just be our HTML? Okay, so we changed the actual function name. Then on this line, towards the end of it, where we are referencing that function, again, we would just get rid of this argument. Instead of a string of text, we would give it an array. Give it 2 arguments inside the array. The first is just $this, right? We're just sort of working with our class. And then the second argument would be quotes, our HTML. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So if I refresh, cool, everything works exactly the same, only now we don't need to come up with these really long, unique names for our functions or methods. Cool, now before we bring this lesson to a close, let's adjust the actual HTML really quick, just so that it sort of looks like a real settings page. So let's get rid of this hello world, and instead I would begin with a div, sort of a wrapper div, and give it a class of wrap. We don't need to write any CSS for this. WordPress will already take care of that on its own. Now inside this wrapper div, let's just create maybe a heading level 1. Again, WordPress will sort of already have styling for that H1. And let's say word count settings. Okay, and for now, that's all we really need. Let's go ahead and give that a save. And if we refresh, cool, you can see that gives us a bit of standardized spacing, a bit of standardized typography, and this is starting to look like a real settings page. Now let's circle back to what we're going to cover in the next video. Remember, the whole point of this page is to let the site owner customize their settings and preferences with regards to the word count statistics. So a look at the finished product. We want to create a form that looks like this. This looks identical to a default WordPress settings screen with sort of the 2 columns and then the signature blue Save Changes button. So that's what we're going to begin doing in the next lesson, adding a form right here together. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn about the Settings API in WordPress. Let's jump right into the action. So currently, this is what our settings page looks like. This area where we would want a form is currently empty. Now remember, this is the finished product of what we want it to look like. And in terms of moving forward here, I think the best way to understand things is to actually look at the end and then work backwards. What I mean by that is our real goal here is just to permanently save the user's preferences into the database. So let's begin by looking at the WordPress database and seeing where it stores settings and option values. So how do we look at our database? Well, if you're using the local WP or local by Flywheel application, just click on the current site that you're running. And then in this area, you'll see a database tab. You can click on that and then just click on this Open Adminer button. Once you click on that, it should open a new tab that looks something like this. And this is the database for your WordPress website. Over here, we see the different tables. The one that I want to draw our attention to right now, though, is called Options. So let's click onto that Options table. And then instead of just showing the structure for the table, let's click this Select Data link. Cool. So this is where WordPress stores all of your preferences, your settings, and options. It's pretty simple. This column, option name, you can just look through these and it's self-explanatory. Right? Your site URL, the name of your site, the description, and if you scroll through this list, you'll see that most of them are a little bit self-explanatory. And then this column is just the value. So really all we're trying to do with our plugin right now is just create a new row in this database table, right? So instead of site URL or blog name or blog description, we would want a new row where the option name is perhaps display location for word count or word count show word count, or word count show character count, or word count show read time, right? We're just trying to create a new option, and then in the value column, this option underscore value, that's where we would just store, for example, whatever the user types in here, their preferences for each of these fields. So that is our end goal. From here, we're just going to sort of work backwards and see how we get here, right? How do we end up getting the user's preferences from an HTML form? How do we get from the form into the actual database? So let's jump back to our empty example where we're going to build things together, and let's get started. Let's jump back into our text editor, and within the construct function in our class, let's just add a new action. So right here, let's say add action. Be sure to include the semicolon. And the name of the action hook is admin underscore init. Okay, comma. The second argument, well, we haven't created a new function yet, but let's just point towards a function, or I should say a method, and then we can create it in about 10 seconds from now. So an array, the first argument is $this, comma, the second argument, well, we just get to make up a simple name for the method. I'll call it settings. Okay, now let's just create a function with that name. So right below the constructor function, we can just say function settings, parentheses, curly brackets. And now let's talk about what I want to do in this function. So before we worry at all about the HTML that we're going to output for the form, we first just need to register the settings or the fields, right, that we want to store in the database. So within here, let's use the WordPress function called register underscore setting. Okay, inside these parentheses, we're going to give it 3 arguments. So 1, 2, 3 as placeholders. Okay, now we're going to use this register setting function once for each of the options. So you can see overall we're going to have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options. So ultimately we're going to use this 5 times, but for now let's just register the very first setting, which will be the display location, right? Do you want the word count post statistics to be at the start of the post or at the end of the post? Okay, so let's talk about these 3 arguments. The first argument is actually the name of the group that this setting belongs to. So let's call it, you could call it anything, but let's call it maybe word count plugin. We'll see where this name comes into play a little bit later in the video. Let's move on though. So this second argument, this is the actual name for this specific setting, right? So in terms of asking the user the display location, do you want it at the beginning or the end? You could name this anything you want, but maybe I'll name it WCP. I'm just making this up, short for word count plugin, and then maybe underscore location. Okay, the third argument is an array with several different options. So let's give it an array. Okay, and then inside this array, we want to give it 2 properties, a sanitize callback, so how we want to either sanitize or validate the value, and then also a default value. So if no value exists in the database yet, what do we want to sort of consider the standard or default answer to be? So let's just say quotes sanitize underscore callback, and then the arrow symbol, right? So equal sign greater than. And let's just set that to underscore sanitize underscore text underscore field. Okay, then have a comma. And then we just need one more property, which is default and arrow symbol. And let's just say that it has a default value of 0, right? So you could store anything you want in the database, right? If we look at the options table again, you can store a string of text, you can store a serialized array, so we can store whatever we want for that option. We could store a string of text that says display at the beginning or display at the end. But in terms of being efficient and not storing more data than we need, I would probably just, with our own logic, say that 0 can mean display at the beginning and a value of 1 can mean display at the end. But that's totally personal preference. Also, before we move on, I do want to let you know that this value of sanitize text field, this is just a standard function in WordPress that will sanitize a user's input value for us. It's sort of a generic WordPress sanitize tool that I like to use. In our next video, we'll learn how we can supply a custom function name here and write our own sanitize function. So not only for sanitization, but if we want to validate an option, right? For example, what if we want to make sure that the number is only 0 or 1 and that the user doesn't somehow enter 2 or a word? So we can learn more about sort of custom validation in the next video. But for now, this just gives us sort of the baked in standard WordPress sanitization. Okay, let's go back to the beginning of this line. So we've registered our setting. So this gives WordPress the info that it would need to store a value in the database. But now we need to tie things back in to our HTML form. So let's do this. Right above this register setting line, let's add a new line and say add underscore settings underscore field. Semicolon here. Now the job of this function is to sort of begin to build out the HTML input field for our form. So we're sort of tying HTML to this setting that we just registered. So within these parentheses here, we're going to give it 5 arguments. So let's add some placeholders. The first argument is the name of the option or setting that we want to tie this to. So basically the name that we registered right here, we chose WCP underscore location. So that's our first value. The second argument is the HTML label text. So what the users will see on the front end, let's say quotes, display, location. The third argument is a function that's responsible for actually outputting the HTML. So this is really nice. We can include our own custom HTML, which is very flexible. So instead of this 3 placeholder, let's give it an array. The first argument is $this, comma. The second argument is just a function or method name that we get to make up. Let's call it location HTML. We'll actually create this function in just a moment, but let's keep going through these arguments. So the fourth argument is the page slug for this settings page that we're working with. So back up in the address bar, remember we chose word-count-settings page. Back in our code, we chose that value when we added an options page. And remember we chose a value of word count settings page for the slug of this page. So you can just copy that, and then that is the fourth argument where we were just working. Okay, and then the fifth and final argument is the section that you want to add this field to. We haven't created any sections yet. We will in just a moment, but let's just make up a name. How about WCP for word count plugin, maybe underscore first section. Now, let me pause for just a minute and say that I am well aware at this point in time, this code is not very intuitive, and it's sort of hard to see how all these puzzle pieces fit together, and there's all these different options and functions, and things are a bit cloudy. Or at least I know the first time that I worked with this API, I thought it was cloudy and confusing. However, we're almost getting to the point where everything sort of connects, and we can begin to see things take shape visually right here. And I think once we get to that point, this will all start to make a little bit of sense. That's just my way of saying if things are confusing right now, that's okay. That's to be expected. However, we just chose this name for a section. Let's go ahead and create that section now. So right above this line that we were just writing, let's say add settings section, semicolon. In these parentheses, we're going to give it 4 arguments. So the first argument is the name of the section. So we chose WCP first section. The second argument is the title for the section. Now, you can include a subtitle for each section. For example, if your settings page was going to have 3 different sections, you could have a subtitle here, a subtitle here, a subtitle here. I don't really want a subtitle. So while we do need to include this argument, if you don't actually want a visible subtitle, you can just make this be a value of null. Okay, and then a similar thing is going on with the third argument. The third argument allows you to have a little bit of content towards the top of a section. So instead of a subheadline, you could have maybe a paragraph of text just sort of any generic HTML content you want. Now, again, I don't really want any content. So while we do want this argument, I'm just going to give it a value of null. Okay, and then this fourth and final argument, this is the page slug that we want to add this section to. So again, if you're ever confused what that would be, it's up in the address bar on your page. So it's word count settings page, or at least that's what I chose. So that's what I'm going to use here, quotes, word count settings page. Okay, and before we actually start to tie things together and output an HTML form, let's just create this function that we said we would create, right? We said that our class should have a method named location HTML. So let's create that really quick. Right below this function, we can just say function location HTML, parentheses, curly brackets. And now where the cursor is, I want to include HTML. So what I like to do is just drop out of PHP right here. And then before the ending curly bracket, you can just go back into PHP. Okay. And right here, we would actually include perhaps an input field or a text area. But just so we can actually see things take shape in the browser, for now, let's just output the word hello. And then we can circle back to the HTML. Okay, now we're finally to the point where we can slowly start to have things make sense, and we're going to connect all the dots now. So let's scroll down, and we're looking for our HTML function. Remember, we set this up at the end of our last lesson, and right now it's just outputting that wrapper div with an H1, right? That's all we see here. So this is where we just actually start to build out the HTML form. So below the heading level 1, let's have a form tag. If you're using VS Code, you can just type form and then hit tab. Okay. For the action, let's give it a value of options.php. WordPress will know what to do with this. That's all we need to say. Let's also give it an attribute of method and set that to equal post. Okay. Now inside the HTML form, this is where things are pretty cool. We don't need to spell out very much. WordPress will do a lot of this for us. So check this out. We just drop into PHP, and let me drop down and then exit PHP again. But inside here, in PHP mode, we're just going to say do_settings sections, semicolon. In these parentheses, we just give it the slug of our settings page. So again, remember up in the address bar, for me, it's word count settings page. Okay, WordPress will automatically look through any sections that have been registered. And remember, we added that one section called first section, and we tied it to this same page. So WordPress will see this, and it will automatically loop through the sections and the fields for us that we registered. Then right below this, let's have the signature looking WordPress blue save or submit button. So we just can call a WordPress function called submit button. Parentheses to call it, semicolon. Let's give this a save and see what it looks like. So if we refresh our page, cool. So we only have one field, so it's not very impressive, but the idea is that WordPress will automatically generate the HTML for us, right? Where this column is your label, and then this column is the actual input field. And then we have the signature looking blue button. Now remember, we just set this to be hello as a quick test. So instead, let's go back right now and change this to be a dropdown, right? An HTML select form element. So back in our text editor, we're just looking for this location HTML function. Instead of hello, let's have a select element. So you can just type select and hit tab in VS Code. We do not need it to have an ID, but we do want it to have a name that matches the setting that we registered. So remember, sort of the variable name that we gave that setting was WCP_location. So that's what we want this name to be, WCP_location. Okay, inside the select, let's have one option. So you can just type option, hit tab. Let's give it a value of 0, but then the actual text that the user sees would be beginning of post. Let's hit drop down. You can just type option again, hit tab, give it a value of 1, but what the user will actually see is end of post. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. And then if we refresh, cool. Now, if we tried to actually select end of post, I will warn you, when we click Save Changes, we're going to run into some errors. So you can see all sorts of errors here. Let me show you the solution to this. The reason this failed is because we're missing one line of code. So just navigate right back to your word count settings screen like this, and let me show you what to fix. Down in our overall our HTML function, right, where we have our wrapper div and the heading level 1 and the form tags, right before this do settings sections line, let's add a new line, and we just say settings underscore fields, semicolon, and we just give it the name of the field group that we chose earlier. So remember, when we registered our setting, we made up a group name of word count plugin. So that's what we would use here, quotes, word count plugin. And what this is going to do, WordPress will do all of the hard work for us. It's going to see this and then add the appropriate hidden HTML fields with the nonce value, the action value. It's going to handle sort of the security and permission aspects for us. So just by including this, if we save and reload the page, now if we try to set this to end of post and hit save, it actually worked, and we see settings saved. Now, we don't see that value here, and that's because we didn't program that select HTML that we just wrote to actually pull the current value from the database to change this, right? So that when you refresh, you actually see the most current value in the database. We can set that up in the next video. I don't want this lesson to go on for too long. But to make sure that things actually worked, all we need to do is look at our database. So remember, back in this tab where you can look at your WordPress database, in the options table, you won't see it if you just scroll down, and that's because you need to go to the very last page. Depending on your WordPress site and how many plugins you've installed, you might have 5, 10, or even 15 or 20 pages of different options. But just click onto the final page, and down at the very bottom, perfect. We see an option named WCP location, and it has a value of 1, right? And that was the final value that we associated with end of post. Cool, so we are well on our way to building a fully functional settings screen. Now that we've got these basics out of the way, we can start to move a lot faster in our next lesson. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to continue building the settings form for our plugin. Let's jump into the action. So in our previous lesson, we successfully set things up so that we were able to save this value of display location end of post into the database, right? That's what this WCP location with a value of 1 instead of 0, that's what that signifies. However, it would be nice if when you refresh this admin page, if that was actually the selected option, right? Instead of it just always selecting the first option when you reload the page. So essentially, let me show you how to make this HTML select element actually come to life. So back in our code, we're looking for our function that we named location HTML, right, with the select element. And we just need to add a little bit of PHP on each of these options. So on this first one, maybe after the value attribute, let's enter into PHP. You can close it out right here as well. Inside PHP, we just want to output the selected attribute if the value in the database matches this current value, right? And then we do the same thing for this one as well. Now you could write your own code to output that, but luckily WordPress has a function named selected. We're going to call that, in these parentheses, we're going to give it 2 arguments. And you just give it 2 values and it will compare the 2, and if they're a match, it will output the word selected into the HTML. So for the first value, let's load that option from the database. To do that, we just say get underscore option, and then you tell it the name of your setting. So remember, we named ours WCP underscore location, right? So that's this value in the database, and it's going to be either 0 or 1. So for the second argument, we would just check for this first option, which would be 0. So string of text, 0. Okay, now let's just copy and paste this entire block of PHP here. and then just add it for this option and just change the value that we're checking for from 0 to 1. Now before we save this and test it out, because this is the first time we've seen this get option function, I want to let you know that there is no performance hit by using it several times. So yes, this value that we're loading is coming from the database, but it's not like WordPress needs to access the database again and again each time we use this function. Essentially, WordPress will load any and all options from the database in one trip. I'll let you know that in the database, notice this third column called auto load. Now these other rows on the screen, they're set to no because they're sort of temporary transient cache data. They're not actual options. But if you go back to maybe the first page of your options table, you will see that almost all of them are set to yes for auto load. And that just means that if it's an option, a user preference, WordPress is going to load that into memory. So we're not making round trips to the database over and over again. Anyways, let's give this a save and test it out. So back in the admin panel, if we refresh, perfect. It selected that option that we have currently set it to in the database. Okay, so this field is looking good. Let's move on to the next field. So if we look at the finished product, the next field would be the headline text, right? That lets the user type in whatever they want for the post statistics headline. So to set that up, let's just jump back into our text editor. And setting up our first field was a lot of work, but now adding subsequent fields and settings is going to be very easy. So for example, in our settings method, let's actually just add a space here just for our own organization in between these lines. So notice these two lines are grouped together, add setting field and register setting. Let's just duplicate these two lines, right? Because these two lines are for that first field. So just select the two lines, copy, right below, paste. So now you can add comments if you want to. You can add a comment, say this one is for location, this one is for the headline text. But essentially now we just make very minimal changes to these new two lines. Why don't we name the option WCP underscore headline. Let's change the label. Maybe headline text. Okay, then we'll need to create a method that is responsible for outputting the HTML. Let's just name that method headline HTML. We can create that in just a moment. These settings look good. We don't need to change those. Okay, let's look at this line, register setting. So the group for the setting would stay the same. We do want to change this to WCP headline. We can use the same generic sanitized text field, but why don't we give it a default value of post statistics? Okay, now before we save this, let's create a method with this name, headline HTML, that actually outputs a bit of HTML for the form element. So right below our settings function, I would just say function headline HTML, parentheses, curly brackets. I would drop out of PHP here, go back into PHP down here. Right here, I would just want to output a little bit of HTML. So you can type input in VS Code and then hit tab. Okay, let's be sure to give it a name of WCP underscore headline. And before we save this, let's just go ahead and pre-populate the field. So if there's a previous value in the database, let's display that here. So we can say value equals, and then let's drop into PHP inside these quotes, and let's just echo, and then we can use that get option function again to load the value. So get option, and we named it WCP headline. Okay, and just for one extra layer of security, even though only admin users will be able to get to this page, for best practices, we do want to escape our output anytime we're taking a dynamic value and trying to put it into HTML. So here's what I would do. Just take this get option, cut that into your clipboard. We're just going to wrap it in a WordPress function called ESC for escape underscore ATTR, short for attribute. Call that function, and then inside that, just paste back in your clipboard. Cool. Let's save this and test it out. So if you refresh your plugin settings page, headline text, let's enter something really custom here. Maybe let's change it to word count info and click save. Cool, you can see the page reloaded. We get this confirmation and that value is sticking in that field. Even if you reload, it's still there. You can go look in the database if you want to. WCP headline with our value. So that field is now done. Let's move on to the next field. So if we look at the finished product, that would be a checkbox for if you want to display the word count, and then the same thing for if you want to display character count or read time. So 3 checkboxes, they're going to be identical. So let's just work through this one, the first one together. And then to avoid repetition, you can pause the video and I'll have you set up these next 2 on your own. But let's be sure to set up this first checkbox together. So back in our code, within our settings function, let's just duplicate these 2 lines again. Right, so this next one will be for the new field. Let's change the option name to maybe WCP word count, right? And then it will be 0 or 1 or true or false if you want to display it. For the label, let's just say word count. For the HTML callback function, let's just change this to word count HTML. The next 2 options can stay the same. Let's look at the next line. The group can stay the same. Let's just change this to WCP word count. Everything else can stay the same except for the default value. Let's give it a default value of 1. Right, by default, we want it to be true or we want that box to be checked. We probably do want to display the word count. Okay, now let's just go create the HTML method. So below our settings function, say function, let me scroll down a little bit. Function word count HTML, parentheses, curly brackets, exit PHP here, enter PHP here. Inside, let's type input and then hit tab in VS Code. For the type, let's change this to checkbox. Okay, let's be sure to give this a name that matches the setting. So that's WCP underscore word count. Let's give it a value of 1, which is just a shorthand way of saying yes or true. Okay, and then let's write a little bit of conditional code so that it looks at the existing database value when you reload this page, and it will check this box or not check it depending on the database. So just like WordPress had that PHP function called selected, it has a similar function called checked. So let's just enter PHP, exit it here. Inside we can use the WordPress function called checked. You just give it 2 values. It's going to compare. For the first value, let's use the get option, and our field or setting is named WCP underscore word count. And for the second value to compare it against, let's just compare it to the value of 1. Okay, let's save this and test it out. So back in the browser, if we reload, word count, yes, we told it to be true by default. Let's uncheck it and then try to save. Perfect. We get confirmation, and even if you reload, it remembers to stay unchecked. But if we test it out and check it, click save, again, perfect. It remembers that preference. We can go look in the database. There it is. Now at this point, to avoid a super repetitive video, there is nothing new for the next 2 fields, right? If we look at the finished product, these 2 checkboxes are exactly the same as this checkbox. The only thing you would need to change is the variable names or the option names that you choose. So right now, I want you to pause the lesson video, and everything that we just did for this word count field, this checkbox, I want you to do the same thing and just add these new fields called character count and read time. Welcome back. So if you're resuming the video, I'll assume that you've added the 2 other checkbox fields. I will talk for just a minute about how I added the next 2 checkboxes. So you would want to register the new setting and add the setting field. However, when it comes to the HTML callback functions, yes, you could have just created 2 additional copies, right? Just literally copied and pasted the checkbox HTML function. However, it might have felt dirty to create 3 copies of essentially the exact same function, because the only thing that's different here is the actual variable name for the option. So while you could have just duplicated the functions, here's what I did. I created a single reusable function called checkbox HTML, and I made sure that it can receive an incoming parameter. We'll talk about what the incoming parameter is in just a moment, but here you can see it's an array. I'm looking inside the array for something called the name. I made up this property of the name, but essentially I hollowed out the only part of the function that is unique, right? So the variable name, and then over towards the right, the variable name again when we're checking it with get option. So this way the function is reusable. Now let's talk a little bit about where this args is coming from. So if we look at add settings field, whenever you use add settings field for the 3 checkboxes, if you scroll over to the right, this section used to be our final argument. I just added a comma and included one more argument, and it's an array. WordPress is expecting this to be an array, and it's going to pass this in to your HTML callback function. Now, yes, there are specific property names that WordPress will know what to do with, but you can also just give it your own made-up properties. So I just made up the name and then gave it a value for each one of these specific variable name. So that's just how I handled it. So you don't have to have these commented out, 3 copies of the function, but it's totally up to you. Anyways, let's move on. So the final thing that I want to cover in this video lesson has to do with custom validation logic. So let's take the display location field as an example. So yes, we programmed the select to only have 2 options, right? This first option has a value of 0. This option has a value of 1. Now, even though only trusted admin users are going to get access to this page, what if one of them is weird and uses their Chrome dev tools? So if I inspect that select, right, there's the select element, and what if I just click on this and change this to have a value of 100, right? And then I go back and I make sure that I click beginning of post, click save. Well, if we look in the database, WCP location now has a value of 100. So this final topic of custom validation is, what if we really want to make sure that this is only allowed to have a value of either 0 or 1? If you give it any other value, it should fail or it should just reset back to its previous value. So back in our code, we want to find the sanitized callback for that field. So here is the display location. When we're actually using the register setting, remember the third argument is an array, and one of the properties is sanitized callback. Now, up until now, we've just been using the WordPress provided generic sanitized text field function. So instead, we can just point this towards one of our own functions, and WordPress will use that instead. So let's get rid of the quotes in this sanitized text field, and instead give it an array. Remember, this is the callable syntax when you want to have a reference to a method from your class. So the first argument is $this, comma. Second argument, we just get to make up our own method name. So quotes, and let's make up a name of sanitize location. Okay, now let's just go create a method with that name. So if we scroll down a little bit, just below that function settings, create a new function, sanitize location, parentheses, curly brackets. Now in the parentheses, we do want to receive a parameter. Let's call it $input. So when WordPress calls our sanitize function, it's going to pass into it the value that the user is trying to save. So now in this function, the first step doesn't have anything to do with WordPress. This is just basic PHP or programming logic. We just want to check to see whatever logic we're checking. So in this case, for this field, I want to check to see if the value is not 0 and it's not 1, then we have a problem. So let's set up that conditional logic. I'll say if, parentheses, curly brackets, for the condition, if input does not equal, so exclamation equal, if it does not equal 0, and if input does not equal 1, if that's the case, then in this if body, I want to do 2 things. I want to add a red error message up here, and then number 2, I also want to return the old value. So not what the user just input, but the previous value that was stored in the database. right? So ultimately, this function needs to return something that is going to get saved into the database. So let's start out with the error. So we'd say add settings error, semicolon, and we're going to give this 3 arguments. The first argument is the name of the option that the error is related to. So this would be WCP_location. The second argument is sort of a slug or identifier for this particular error. Essentially, WordPress will add into our HTML ID equals and then whatever name we give it here. So you can make up a name. I'll just say WCP location_error, but any name would do. And then the final argument, this is the actual message that you want to display to the user. So let's say display location must be either beginning or end. Okay? After that line, but still within the if block, we now want to return the old value from the database, right? We definitely don't want to return whatever incorrect value the user tried to submit. So let's return and then just use get option, semicolon. The one we're looking for is WCP_location. Okay, now if this is not the case, meaning if the user did enter a value that is correct or that we want to allow, then just below the if, so right here, we can just return $input, right? Whatever they tried to send along. Let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So if I refresh, if I choose one of the normal values, it should work no problem. Cool. But if I refresh and if I use my dev tools and I try to set the value of this first option to 500 and then select that and save, perfect. We see this red error message and the save did not go through. So if you look in the database, it still has that previous value of 1, right? Not 500. All right, and that is going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, now that our form is complete, now that we're saving the user's preferences, it's time to actually build the plugin itself, right? So if we look at the finished product, it's time to actually write the code that assembles the text that gets added in to a blog post detail screen. It should be fun to sort of connect the dots and get our plugin truly up and running. So let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to begin coding the actual feature of our plugin. Let's jump into the action and let me explain. So this is a sneak peek of the finished product. And on a single detail blog post screen, you can see that the plugin is dynamically adding this word count statistics before the actual body content. So in this lesson, we just want to write a bit of PHP that's going to output the headline and then the 3 statistics, right? The word count, character count, and the approximate read time. So let me jump back over to a tab where I have not completed this yet, and we're going to work on this together. So let's jump into our text editor, and what we want to do is filter the content for a post. Now we've actually already seen this filter hook a few lessons ago. So in our constructor function, let's just add a new line and say add _filter, semicolon. We're going to give it 2 arguments. So the first is the _content, comma, and then let's just point towards a method that we're going to create in about 10 seconds. So we can use the array callable syntax. So array, the first argument is $this. The second argument is just a name that we get to make up. So you could choose any name you want, but I'm actually going to name it ifWrap. Okay, then I would just create a function with that name. So function ifWrap parentheses, curly brackets. Now I'm doing this because we only really need to change or filter the content if A, you're on a single blog post screen, and B, if the user has any of the 3 checkboxes checked. So for example, if I go into settings, word count, if someone unchecks all 3 of these checkboxes, then we don't need to filter or manipulate the content. Now you could have wrapped this overall add filter line in an if statement. That would make a lot of sense. However, it's just my personal preference that I like my constructor function to be very clean and minimal. I like to be able to look at the constructor function at a quick glance and immediately see the actions and filters that I'm using. So this is just how I'm going to do it. But in our if wrap function, inside the body, let's set up an if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets, for the condition in these parentheses, let's say only if this is the main query, parentheses to call that, and if this is a single blog post page, so parentheses to call that. Okay, so we've already used and in our condition. Now I also want to use or in our condition. So here's what I'm going to do. Wrap both of these in a set of parentheses. So right before the word is, another opening parentheses, and then in between these two closing, have another closing. Okay, and then I'm going to add a space right here. And then I'm going to say and then another set of parentheses. And now in here, I'm going to use or, and I'm going to include all three of our checkbox options. So if this one is checked, or if this one is checked, or if this one is checked. So if even just one of them is checked, then we are going to want to manipulate the content. So in this set of parentheses, I would just say get underscore option. The first one, we named it WCP underscore word count. Now after that string of text, but still inside there, I would say comma, the default value of 1. This default value is important because if the user just installs your plugin and then they haven't actually checked and unchecked and rechecked boxes and saved all their settings, well, this option won't actually exist in the database yet, right? If the user is just using the default option, we won't find anything in the database, so then WordPress will use this value that we're providing here as a fallback. Okay, so just after that one set of parentheses, now we can say, or if get option, this one would be quotes, WCP underscore character count, after the quotes, comma, default value, after just the one closing parentheses, one more, or get option, quotes, WCP read time. Again, the second option, the default value. I realized that line of code was very difficult to follow along with, so you can pause the video right now. I've broken it down to fit on multiple lines, or also know that you can always download my finished code for each lesson. There's a downloadable zip file that you can find after each video. Anyways, big picture, we just want to make sure that both of these are true and any single one of these is true. If that's the case, right, then in the curly brackets for our if statement, let's return. And what do we want to return? Well, we want a chance to manipulate or change the content for a blog post. So in this function that we're creating, let's make sure we have a parameter. You could name it anything, like maybe input. I'll name it content. So $content. And then since this function already has a bit of complexity to it, I'm just going to pass the task off to a new function that will only have the one single responsibility of manipulating the string of text. So I'm just going to say $this, right, our class or this instance of the object. Let's look inside it with dash greater than, and then we can make up a method name that we'll create in about 10 seconds from now. You can name this method whatever you want. I'll call it create HTML. Parentheses to actually call it, semicolon, and then in these parentheses, let's just pass along the default version of the content before we get to manipulate it. So $content. Okay, now that was if our condition is met. If our condition is not met, well, then just right below the if statement right here, we can simply return $content without modifying it in any way. Cool. At this point, let's just go create a method now with this name, create HTML. So right about here, I would just say function create HTML, parentheses, curly brackets. Let's make sure to have a parameter. Again, you could call it anything. I'll call it $content. Okay, and before we move forward, if you want to make sure that your code is working so far, in this function, you can just return $content and then concatenate on maybe just a space and the word hey or hello. Semicolon, and let's hit save and test it out. So if we refresh on a single blog post detail screen, down at the very bottom of your content, you should see hello. And to truly test that our logic is working, you can just go into your plugin settings screen and uncheck all three of these. Save changes, reload again. Notice the hello goes away. Cool. So let's put those settings back. Okay, and let's move forward and actually begin coding the real content. So back in our code, actually, I do want to take a quick timeout and explain the difference between this syntax, where we're calling a method in our class, versus this syntax, where we're providing a reference to one of our methods. So down here, we didn't need to use the array callable syntax. We could just directly begin looking inside the class or this instance of the object, and then simply call the method. This is because we wanted to call and execute this method right here, right now. Up here, we are not the ones calling the method, so we don't want to call it right here, right now. We're just passing a reference to the method into WordPress, and then WordPress is responsible for actually executing and calling the methods at just the right moment. Okay, so hopefully that clears up the difference between this syntax and this syntax. Also, just a quick note, while I'm looking at this code, I'm realizing that we actually didn't need the inner set of parentheses to group these two conditions. I think I was sort of caught up in the moment of thinking of the actual logic and not so much thinking about the code syntax itself. So you could get rid of this inner parentheses right before is main query, and then you can get rid of this closing parentheses right here, right? There's really no need to group these two. So we're just saying if this is true, and if this is true, and if any one of these three is true. Cool. Now at this point, let's actually get to the fun part of the lesson, building out our create HTML method. Why don't we begin by outputting a heading level 3 that says post statistics, or whatever the user has typed into their custom title field. So we don't actually want to return the content plus hello. We can give ourselves a clean slate in this method. And why don't we create a variable that we can keep adding on to as we go? So we can name it anything we want, but I'm going to name it $HTML. And let's set it to equal a string of text. Let's just add a semicolon right now so we don't forget. In the string of text, let's have a heading level 3. After the heading level 3, let's have an opening p tag. And then a bit later, we can actually fill in that paragraph and close it out. But for now, we just want to open it. Okay, now inside the h3 tags, this is where we want to say post statistics or whatever the user entered. So let's do this. Let's close out this first part of the string and then concatenate on something else. For now, you can just hit X as a placeholder. And then you'd want to concatenate on and then just open up another string. Okay, now we didn't actually want the X as a placeholder. Instead, what we would want here is get option, and back in the admin panel, remember this field where the user can type in their own custom headline text? We named that option or that field WCP_headline. If the user hasn't entered a custom value yet, or if they just installed the plugin and we need a default or fallback value, let's say quotes, post statistics. Okay, we're almost ready to test this out. On a new line, but still in this function, now let's just add this onto the standard blog post content. Now we do want to pay attention to whether we should add it to the beginning of the content or to the end of the content. So here's how I would handle that. I would just open up an if statement for the condition if get option. We named it WCP_location, comma, and we'd actually want that to have a default value of 0. Remember, we said by default it should be at the beginning of the post, and we set the value of 1 to mean at the end of the post. In between these two closing parentheses, I'm going to say if that equals 0, obviously this would equal 0, but we want to make sure if it's coming from the database, if the user has actually saved that option or changed it from the default value. If that is 0, then we would just want to add on our content to the beginning of the blog post content. So if that was the case, I would just return our HTML plus or concatenate on $content. If this is not the case, then we would want to add our HTML at the end of the content. So right below this if statement, we can just say return $content concatenate on $HTML. So just the reverse. Okay, let's give this a save and test it out. So back on the front end, if we reload, cool, up at the very top of the post, we see post info. And if I change this to end of post and save the changes and then reload, cool, now it's down at the very bottom of the post. At this point, we're ready to actually start outputting the word count, character count, and read time. So right after this line where we have $HTML equals our headline, right below that, let's just begin adding the content that would live inside this paragraph. So I'll write a comment to ourselves and let's say, let's calculate or get the word count once and save it in a variable, because we're going to need the word count for both outputting the word count and for calculating the read time. So we don't want to have to calculate or count the word count more than once. Okay, now we can make up any variable name we want, but I'll call it word count equals, and then in PHP there's a function called str word count, semicolon here, and then you could just include $content inside here. However, to be more accurate, let's first use strip tags so that we don't count individual HTML element tags. We just count actual content. So strip tags, call that, and give that the WordPress content. Now you could leave this line on its own. However, if your blog post had thousands and thousands of words, maybe you would only want to bother counting how many words there are if the word count or read time checkboxes were checked, right? Because if only the character count checkbox was checked, this would just be a wasted calculation. So what you could do is just cut this line into your clipboard and say if, parentheses, curly brackets, and the condition would just be if get option WCP word count, the default value of 1 for yes, or if get option WCP read time, default value of 1. If either of those are true, then we do actually want to calculate the word count. Cool, so now let's just actually add a little bit of text into this paragraph. So right below this, we can just say if, parentheses, curly brackets, if word count is set to yes. So you could actually just reuse this, copy and paste this to save a bit of typing. If this condition is true, then we would just want to add on to our HTML variable. So you could just say $HTML dot equal sign to add on to the end of it. And we could just say this post have a space, concatenate on word count, and then concatenate on another string, have a space after the word count number and say words, end the sentence, and then let's have a BR tag, semicolon. Okay, now let's just do the same thing for character count. You could actually just use these 3 lines as a template and copy and paste that. So this would just be WCP character count, and then we would change this post this would be characters, and instead of $word count we would say strlen. This is a PHP function that will give us the length of a string, so call it. Now you could give it content, but I'm going to use strip tags and then give that $content. Why don't we give this a save and test it out? So if I refresh, cool. This post has this many words, this many characters. Finally, let's add the approximate read time. Now there are a million different ways that you could calculate this, but I performed a little bit of Google research and it said that the average adult reads approximately 225 words per minute. So with that in mind, here's how I would set that up. Right below this character count option, I would just say, well, I would actually just use these 3 lines as a template again, so copy and paste, duplicate them. If get option WCP read time, okay, this intro text would be, instead of this post has, I would say this post will take about, and then we can change this in just a minute, but imagine this was 5, the number 5, and then it would say minutes to read. So we just change this, minutes, and you could put the S in parentheses like it's optional, minutes to read. For a bit of extra credit, if you didn't want the parentheses and you wanted to say minute if this was 1, and then minutes if it was any other number, for a bit of extra credit, just look up PHP ternary operator. But for now, this will do the trick. Anyways, instead of $word count, what we would really want right here is word count divided by 225. And then we don't want an awkward decimal, so I would just round this up or down to the nearest whole number. So you can just use the PHP round function. So opening parenthesis there, closing parentheses here. Let's save this and give it a try. So if we refresh, cool, this post will take about 2 minutes to read. And let me go find a shorter post so we can see if it'll just say just 1 minute. Another example post. Yep. This is a much shorter post with only 2 small paragraphs, and you see it'll take about 1 minute to read. Cool. Just for one final detail, let's not forget to close out the ending tag for this P or paragraph element. So just right down here, before this if logic where we're actually returning something, just right here, I would say $HTML. Just give it a string of a closing paragraph tag, semicolon, give it a save, and we're in business. So let's test this out if you put this back to the beginning of the post. So beginning of post, save, reload, perfect. I think this looks pretty good. One last security detail that I forgot because I was just trusting our admin users. But even if our admin users are super trustworthy, if our database somehow had malicious data injected into it, we never want our front end to output dynamic content without escaping it. So on this heading level 3 line, just wrap this get option, wrap that inside the escape HTML function, just like this. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next video, before we start working on a new plugin, we're actually going to take a break to learn about translations or localization. In other words, how to make your plugin easy to translate into any language in the world. Imagine you make a plugin and it becomes very popular, and people from around the world would volunteer to translate it into their language. So we want to make sure that our WordPress code makes that easy to do. It should be a lot of fun to set up. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to make a plugin or theme easy to translate into another language. There are 2 main steps involved here. Number 1 is sort of hollowing out the code of our plugin so that it's flexible. And step number 2 is just using software that can automatically create sort of a template file so that it's simple for just about anyone to contribute a translated version of our plugin. Let's go ahead and get started with step number 1, which is us sort of hollowing out our code. Now, we're not going to hollow out the entirety of our plugin because that would be super repetitive. Instead, I'm just going to pick 2 little pieces of text that will make flexible or translatable. It's something that when you do once, you'll know how to do it anywhere and everywhere that you need to. So for example, 1 string of text in our plugin that I'm going to make translatable in the admin dashboard. If you look in the settings menu, remember we have this link called word count that points towards our setting page. Well, let's make this actual text right here translatable. So for example, if someone was using our plugin and their installation of WordPress is using the Spanish language, well, assuming our plugin has been translated into Spanish, it should output Spanish right here. Okay, and then on the front end, just for another quick example, in our post info or word count statistics, let's just translate this first sentence that says, this post has X number of words. So just hollowing out those 2 pieces of text will show you everything you need to know to make your entire plugin or theme translatable. Okay, so at this point, let's get started. Let's jump into our text editor. And our very first step is to add a new couple of lines up at the very top within these comments. So we currently have these properties like plugin name and description. Let's just add a new property, and it needs to be named text domain, colon. And now you can make up your own name, but I'm going to call it WCP domain. I'm just making this up. It's short for word count plugin domain. So just choose something that's unique to your plugin or theme. Okay, and then we want one other property. It is domain path colon, and let's give it a value of /languages. So this is just going to point towards a folder in our plugin folder, and it will be a new folder called languages. This will contain sort of the overall translation template and then any and all translated versions that we create. So maybe Spanish or German. Cool. So with just these two comments in place, we're ready to get started. Let's begin hollowing out a few strings of text in our plugin. So remember, let's begin with the admin link under the settings menu, this text right here that says word count. So in our plugin code, down towards the bottom, I'm just looking for our function that we named admin page. And when we're adding an options page here, this second argument. So here's what we do. Let's remove this string of text that just says word count. And instead, we're going to use a function that's just underscore underscore. So 2 underscores, and then we just call it. And now we give it 2 arguments. So A comma B as placeholders. The first argument is the original text. So we're creating this plugin originally in English. So we would just say that text we had just a moment ago, word count. And then the second argument is your plugin or theme's text domain. So remember, I named mine WCP domain. Cool, that's it. We just made that little piece of text or that string dynamic and easily translatable. Let's move on to the second example. Remember, we want to make this text that says, this post has blank words, easy to translate. So back in our code, let's look in our function that we named createHTML. Here it is, and then we're looking for the word count. For me, it's around line number 40. It will be a little bit different for you, but we see this post has, and now you'll notice that we sort of hard-coded the empty space within this string. Now, when people are providing translations for our code, we don't want them to have to unintuitively have an empty space at the end of their translation. So let's adjust this a little bit. So let's get rid of that space here, and then let's just add on an empty space like this. So now this can just be sort of the hollowed out placeholder. So let's get rid of this very first string, and we'll use underscore underscore, just call the function. So we'll say this post has, and then the second argument is our text domain, WCP domain. Cool. Let's do the same thing for words at the end. So again, we want it to begin with an empty space so the words don't run together. So let's just concatenate on an empty space and then concatenate on this, so we don't need the space there anymore. Now we don't need to translate the period at the end of the sentence or the HTML BR tag. So let's just end the quote here and then concatenate on just an opening quote like this. Right, so that way when people are providing translations for our code, they're only translating this little piece of text right here, just the word words. So now we can get rid of that and instead say underscore underscore, call it words. The second argument is our WCP domain. Okay, so we've hollowed out those 2 examples. Now before we save this file and I show you how to actually begin providing a translation in whatever language you want to experiment with, I'm going to choose Spanish. Before we get to that, there's just one more step. So let's go back up to the top of this file. We just need to add a little bit of code to tell WordPress to actually load our text domain files. We don't have any language files yet, but in just a moment when we actually go create a translation, we'll want to make sure that WordPress loads those files. Right, so that way when you go into the settings of your WordPress installation and if you switch the WordPress system language to Spanish, our plugin should know to just be automatically loading our translated files. So here's how we do that. Within our constructor function, let's just add a new top level action. So I'm going to say add action, semicolon, the name, let's just use the init action hook. Okay, and then let's use the callable syntax. So array, $this, comma, let's make up a method name. I'll just call it languages. You could call it anything you want to. And now let's create a function with that name. So function languages, parentheses, curly brackets. And here we're just going to use a WordPress function called load underscore plugin underscore text domain, parentheses to call it, semicolon. And we're going to give it 3 arguments. So A, comma B, comma C as placeholders. The first argument is our text domain. So again, I chose a value of WCP domain. The second argument, I'm actually not 100% sure what this is. In the WordPress documentation, it just says deprecated and it instructs you to use a value of false. So that's what I'm going to go with. If you're super curious about this, you can just perform a Google search for this function name to find the official WordPress documentation. Okay, and then the third argument is just a path that points towards our languages folder. So instead of C, we can say dir name, call that function. Inside these parentheses, we can say plugin underscore base name, which is a function itself, so call that. Inside these parentheses, let's say underscore underscore file underscore underscore. Okay, and then after these 2 parentheses, but before the final third closing parentheses, let's add on a string of text / languages. If this was hard to type out with me, that's okay. You can always download the zip file for this video lesson to just copy and paste the code from my code. Okay, now I believe the translation software will create this folder for us if it doesn't exist, but just to play it safe in our plugin folder, why don't we go ahead and create it right now? So go ahead and create a brand new folder in your plugin folder, and let's call it languages. Okay, at this point, we're ready to save our file and learn how to actually create a translation. Now, there are many different ways to create a translation, but I'd say the 2 most common are, number 1, a piece of software named Poedit. It's available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So that's one way to create a translation. The second way, which is the way I'm going to show you in this video lesson, is to use a WordPress plugin called Loco Translate. Now, there's nothing wrong with Poedit. I'm just a huge fan of this Loco Translate plugin. I feel like it's really optimized for WordPress. Its attention to detail is excellent. And as we'll even see in our next chapter, this plugin makes it easy to even translate for our JavaScript code. So I'm a big fan of this plugin. I strongly recommend that you use it. So let's go install this plugin right now. So in the admin dashboard, I'll go under plugins, add new. I will search for Loco Translate. It should be the first result. As of today, it's by Tim Whitlock, and you can see it has over 1 million active installations. So let's go ahead and install. Okay, and then be sure to activate the plugin. Okay, now in the admin dashboard, down towards the very bottom, you'll see a new option called Loco Translate. Let's go ahead and click on that. So yes, you can also use this plugin to translate a theme, but right now we're interested in translating a plugin. So if you scroll down towards the bottom here, running plugins, here we see our test plugin. And we know it's the plugin that we were just recently working on because we see that its text domain is that familiar WCP domain. So let's just go ahead and click on our test plugin. Okay, now before we actually create a translation, let's first create a template. So Loco Translate will look through our code for whenever we used the underscore underscore function. It will do a lot of the hard work for us, so we can just click Create Template. Cool, you can see it's going to create the template file in our plugins folder in the languages folder. Let's click Create Template. Okay, now with that template created, we can actually create a translation. Again, I'm going to use Spanish, so if you want to follow along with me, let's just click New Language. So option number 1, choose a language. I'm just going to click here. The list of languages is very long, but if you just start to type, I'll type Spanish. It's a very long list. It's actually falling off the bottom edge of my screen right now, but if I click it, you can see that I chose Spanish Mexico. Okay, then for option number 2, I like to use this author option. So you can see it's going to output the file into our plugins folder, our actual plugin folder, and then in the languages subfolder. This is the option we want, right? As a plugin author, this is excellent. So let's click Start Translating. And this is the moment we've been waiting for. So this area down here has all of the different strings of text that it detected. And if we want to translate one, let's go with, for example, this post has. So you just click on that. So here's the source text, but then down here, this is where we can enter the translation. So I will just type esta entrada tiene, right? So just this post has in Spanish. Okay, let's also be sure to translate the word words. So I'll click on words right here. So down here, the Spanish translation of that is palabras. Okay, and then finally, let's translate the word count. Remember, this is the admin dashboard setting link text, so we can just click on that. For the translation, I will say, el recuento de palabras. Okay, for now I'm done, so just scroll up and click Save. Obviously, in the real world, if you were truly translating a theme or plugin, you would probably fill in 10, 20, 30, or even 50 translations. But we're just setting up a few as a quick example. Okay, so once you save your changes, now let's pretend that we actually are using WordPress with this language. So instead of English, let's go in to the WordPress settings screen. You don't even need to go into the submenu links, just the general main overview settings screen of WordPress. If you scroll down a little bit, maybe about halfway down the page, we see an option named Site Language. So mine is set to English, but let's click on this, and then I'm just going to search for Spanish of Mexico. And now be ready to see WordPress in a different language, so maybe try to memorize where certain things are. But let's click Save Changes. Right, so we're simulating that someone is using our plugin and their WordPress is in a different language. So you can see the entire admin dashboard is now in that language. Well, aside from my custom post types, because I didn't actually translate that code. But all of the default options in WordPress have been translated. And let's look for our word count translation. So under the settings menu, remember the very last link? Perfect, there it is. So this is word count translated into Spanish. Let's look on the front end of our website. So if you refresh a single blog post detail screen, perfect. So this post has X number of words. Cool. And if we look in our plugin folder, in the languages subfolder, here is our overall template file. So people who are used to translating software, you can just give them this file and they will know what to do with it. And then oftentimes they will supply you with this sort of file, right? These files ending in .mo or .po. So if you have your plugin or theme translated into 10 or 20 different languages, then you would want to include, right, 10 or 20 different versions of these files in your plugin code like we have here. This way, no matter which language the user's WordPress installation is set to, you have them covered. Cool. Now, before we bring this lesson to a close, there is one security-related issue that I want to bring to your attention. So let's say that somehow, some way, one of the translated files that you're using has been compromised or has malicious code in it. In this case, maybe just a bit of HTML, like a strong or bold tag. That's not very malicious, but imagine it could be a script tag. The possibilities are endless, but really quick, I just want to show you how and why you would maybe escape text that's coming from a translation when you're actually outputting it as HTML. So for a quick example, let's go edit the translation for this esta entrada tiene. So if we go back into Loco Translate and we click on our test plugin and we click on the Espanol. So let's find that this post has. Now imagine if we just wrap the word entrada in a strong tag. Obviously that in and of itself isn't malicious, but imagine if someone used a script tag and tried to include actual code. So this is just an example of proof of concept, but if we save this and then if we refresh, notice that that actually did make the text bold, implying that text from the translation file is actually rendering as HTML, which is a potential security issue. So we just want to make sure that we escape this. So back in our code, let's look for our create HTML method. right? And here is the word count. You can see we're using this translation function, the underscore underscore. Instead of just underscore underscore, there's actually a function called ESC for escape underscore HTML and then underscore underscore. So just by changing which function we use here, now if we save and refresh, we're getting that same translation factor, right? It's pulling from the Spanish translation, but now it's not letting any actual HTML be rendered. It's escaping this into similar characters. So we're a bit more secure now, and that is going to bring this lesson to a close. So feel free to set your WordPress installation back to whatever language you were using before we started this lesson. So I will go back into General Settings and just set my language back to English. Cool. Let's talk about where we go from here. So in our very next lesson, because practice makes perfect, we're going to start on a new plugin, and we're still going to be focusing on PHP for just this one more plugin before we jump into the next chapter, which is about JavaScript. So let me give you a sneak peek preview. In our next lesson, the PHP-based plugin that we're going to create is this word filter. There are two big things that make this plugin unique or different from the plugin we just built. So number one, if I click onto the settings page, this settings page is not using the WordPress generated form builder. So remember all of those confusing functions like section and field and having WordPress automatically loop through them? Now there are pros and cons to the auto-generated WordPress form pages. WordPress will automatically handle things for you like the nonce, different security issues, the form submission. However, there are times where you want to have full control over things. So we're going to learn how to have a completely custom settings page with all of our own code, both the HTML and the PHP that's processing the data. Okay, the other thing that's unique about this plugin is we're actually getting a top level menu in the admin dashboard sidebar, and we're actually going to learn how to have our own SVG icon instead of a generic dash icon. Cool. This should be a lot of fun to set up. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then. Hey, hope you're enjoying the video so far. This is just a quick note that the next 4 lessons are only available in my full 36-hour premium WordPress development course. If that's something you're interested in the description for this video down below, you'll find a heavily discounted coupon link to join the course at the best price. Having said that, in this YouTube video right now, we're going to skip ahead to the JavaScript chapter. This should be a lot of fun. Thanks for watching. Let's jump into the action. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're starting a new chapter. Now, we're still within the 3-chapter plugin development section, but now our focus is going to be on JavaScript. In particular, I want to show you how we can use JavaScript to create new custom block types. Let's jump right into the action and let me explain. So if I begin to edit one of my posts, right, this screen is the modern block editor, and we know that by default, WordPress ships with a few basic block types. Each one of these is a paragraph block. I can try to insert a new block that perhaps is an image or a headline, gallery, list, quote. However, what if we as a developer want to create our own brand new, completely custom block type, and then we want to share it with the world as a plugin? Well, in order to do that, we need to dig into JavaScript. Because as you might have guessed, these block types are fairly interactive. In real time, you are changing the text or choosing different options and customizing them. And in order to have things happen in real time like that, we need to use JavaScript. So in this chapter, we're going to use JavaScript and learn a little bit about the framework called React in order to build our own custom block types. Right? So our goal is when you try to insert a new block, we want a brand new type that we ourselves created. So without further ado, right now, let's go create a new empty plugin folder and begin moving forward together. So do this with me. In your WordPress installation, look for the WP content folder and then go into the plugins folder. and then we just want to create a brand new empty folder, right? We're creating a new plugin together. So you can name the new folder whatever you want. Try to name it something unique, so a name that no other plugin has ever used before. Several lessons from now, once we're actually up and running, we're going to start building a multiple choice quiz type of block type. So I'm going to name my new folder, Are You Paying Attention? Okay, but you can choose whatever name you want. Then just go ahead and open up your new folder in your text editor. Inside our folder, let's create a new JavaScript file. So new file. This will just be a quick test to see how things work. So why don't we name the file test.js. Inside the file, just so we can make sure that it's actually loading, let's begin with an annoying alert pop-up. So just call the alert function and let's say hello from our new JS file. Let's give that a save. And now, even though most of our work in this chapter is going to be in JavaScript, we still need to use PHP to register a new plugin and then tell WordPress to load our JavaScript file when you're on the post editor screen. So in our new folder, let's create a PHP file. So new file, let's name it index.php. To save a bit of time in our new PHP file, I'm just going to paste in my clipboard. You can either pause the video and type this out, or really I'm just recycling the code from our previous plugin. So we're entering into PHP the generic plugin attributes, right? The name, the description, the version, the author, and then this line of code that prevents people from triggering our code by visiting the URL for this PHP file. Okay, with this boilerplate code out of the way, let's go ahead and create a PHP class. And then once we have our class up and running, we just want to enqueue or load our JavaScript file. So let's make up a new class, and then we can make up a name. I'll call it Are You Paying Attention? No parentheses, just curly brackets. Below this, let's create a new instance of our class. So let's make up a variable name, $, let's call it maybe just lowercase Are You Paying Attention? And set that to equal a new instance of our class. So are you paying attention, parentheses to actually use it or call it, and then end with a semicolon. Now in our class, let's create the constructor function. So that's just function __ construct, parentheses, curly brackets. Now getting back to the actual task at hand, we just want to tell WordPress to load our JavaScript file when you're on the block editor screen. So inside the construct function, we want to add an action. So add action, semicolon. We give it 2 arguments. The action hook name that we're interested in is onCue, which is a very easy word to misspell, but onCue block editor assets. The second argument is a function that we want to run. Let's use the array callable syntax. So the first argument is $this, then we make up a method name. How about admin assets? Okay, then let's go create a method with this name. So still in our class, but just below the construct function, we'll say function, let me scroll down a bit. Function admin assets, parentheses, curly brackets, and then we're just going to onCue a JavaScript file. So we've already seen this back during the theme development chapters, but it's a function that WordPress offers to us named WP onCue script. Semicolon. We're going to give it 3 arguments for now. So ABC. The first argument is just a name that we're sort of giving this JavaScript file, right? Sort of a short name or variable name so WordPress can identify it. You can make up anything you want. I'll call it our new block type. The second argument is just a URL that points towards our JavaScript file. So let's use the WordPress function called plugin dir URL, parentheses to call it. Inside there, let's use the constant of __ file __. So this will give us the URL of the folder that the current file is in. And then after that, so after the parentheses but before the comma, we're just going to concatenate on a string of text and just point towards our JavaScript file. So we named it test.js. Okay. The third argument is a list of dependencies. So let's give this an array, and for now, the only thing we really truly need to load is something called, so a string of text, WP-blocks. Now don't worry, in a few minutes we will learn what WP blocks is. So we'll learn why we're loading it here as a dependency and actually how to begin leveraging and using it. But for now, why don't we go ahead and save this and test it out. So back in WordPress, the first thing we need to do is go activate our new plugin. So back on the generic admin dashboard screen, in the sidebar, let's go under plugins. Let's find the new one that we just created. So remember, I named mine, Are You Paying Attention Quiz? So just go ahead and activate your plugin. Okay, and what we want to do now is test to make sure that the editor screen is loading our JavaScript file. So if we just go into posts and begin editing a post, perfect. We see that annoying alert pop up, hello from our new JavaScript file. This is great. So that means our own custom JavaScript file is loading on this screen. From here, it's very easy to register a new custom block type. So let's just write a little bit of JavaScript code together. So back in our test.js file, let's get rid of the annoying alert pop-up. And instead, let's say wp dot, well, if you're using VS Code as your text editor like I am, you might have just got this exact same annoying feature. So when I typed WP and then attempted to type dot, it just sort of auto-filled that in for me. Now, this is not what I want. So what you can do is type WP and then hit the escape key. And now I can type dot, okay, WP dot blocks dot register block type. And this is a method, so we want to call it. Before we give it any arguments, let's first talk about where this is coming from. So WordPress itself is going to add something called WP to the browser's global scope. Inside that object, there's going to be something called blocks, and inside that, there's something called register block type. So remember back in our PHP file when we listed WP-blocks as a dependency? Well, this is why. Because we want to make sure that it has already been loaded before WordPress loads our JavaScript file. So that way, we have no problems just accessing this from the global scope. So we're just using a function that WordPress gives to us, and now we want to give it two arguments. So a comma b. The first argument is the short name or variable name for our block type. So instead of a, let's give it quotes. And we actually want to begin with a namespace that is unique to our plugin. So why don't we call it our plugin / and now you get to the actual short name for our block type. I'll call it Are You Paying Attention? Okay, the second argument is a configuration object. So that just means we're going to give it curly brackets for an object in JavaScript. Inside the curly brackets, we can drop down, and now we're just going to spell out a few properties. So we need to use very precise or exact property names that WordPress knows to look for. The first one will be title. So title, : we give it a string of text. Now this is what people will actually see, so we are free to have spaces and uppercase letters. So let's say, are you paying attention, ? After that, let's have a comma. We want another property. Let's call it icon. And for now, we can just use a dash icon. So let's just say smiley, comma. Let's have another property called category. Let's just place it in the common category. There's also layout. I believe there's one called typography or text. For now, let's just go with common. Okay, now we want two more properties. So comma, we want property named edit. Now for its value, instead of giving it a string of text, we want to give it a function, a JavaScript function. So now we will learn more about code organization later on, but for now, let's just give it an anonymous or inline function. You could even give it an ES6 arrow function if you wanted to, but I'll just say function, parentheses, curly brackets. We will circle back to the body of the function in just a moment. But after this closing curly bracket, let's have a comma, and we want our configuration object to have one more property named save, : and again, for its value, this should be a function. So function, parentheses, curly brackets. Now let's talk a little bit about what the edit and save functions are used for. The edit function controls what you'll see in the admin post editor screen, whereas the save function controls what the actual public will see in your content. So in both functions, we'll want to return a value, but we can't just return a traditional string of text. Instead, WordPress has its own way of describing and rendering HTML through JavaScript, and so we need to do things the way that WordPress is expecting us to. Let me explain what I mean. So in the edit function, what we want to do is return something. And what do we want to return? Well, we're going to start out by looking in the global or window scope of JavaScript for something called wp.element.createElement, which is a method, so parentheses to call it. So we're just leveraging this function that WordPress adds to the global scope of the browser. And this is the official WordPress way of creating an HTML element from within JavaScript. So within these parentheses, we're going to give it 3 arguments. So you could say A, B, C. The first argument is the type of HTML element you want to create. So a string of text, maybe this would be a P for paragraph element, or an unordered list, or a list item, or heading level 1. Just for a quick example, why don't we add a heading level 3? Okay. The second argument is any attributes or properties that describe this element. So for example, if you wanted to give it an HTML class, or if you wanted to give it an inline style attribute. For now, we're just going to leave that blank, so we'll just give it a value of null. And then the third argument is the children or content for this element. So this is where we would include the actual text that would live inside the heading level 3. So let's say quotes, hello, this is from the admin editor screen. Okay, now in terms of our save function, let's just use this exact same code but slightly edit it. So I'm just going to copy this entire line into my clipboard, paste it into the save function, only let's change the third argument to instead say, this is the front end. Okay, and just to make the difference crystal clear, you could even change the element to a heading level 1. Let's go ahead and save this. Now, technically, WordPress will always load WP element on the post editor screen. That's a very safe bet. However, it is a best practice to describe and tell WordPress what our plugin needs or what it depends on. So if we wanted to follow a best practice and really play it safe, we could go back into our PHP file. And when we're loading our JavaScript file, remember our array of dependencies? You could go ahead and say, comma, quotes, WP dash element. Just to be 100% sure that that will already be loaded and exist before WordPress loads our file. So let's save that and give it a test. So on the post editor screen, be sure to reload or refresh. Okay, now imagine in between these 2 paragraphs, I want to insert a new block. So cool, you should see it as the very first option. Are you paying attention? If you don't see it, you could also always use the search menu to search for are you paying attention. Either way, let's just click it to actually insert it into our post. Cool, there's that heading level 3. Hello, this is from the admin editor screen. Now, if we actually click save or update and then view this blog post on the front end of our website, if we scroll down a little bit, there we see the heading level 1. This is the front end. Now right away, the first thing I want to do is demystify what's going on here on the front end. What I mean by that is WordPress is absolutely not loading JavaScript right here on the front end. Now, yes, on the admin screen, WordPress is actually calling our JavaScript function to generate this element that we see on the edit screen. But once you actually click update or save, well, whatever our save method returns, that's just going to get saved into the database as a traditional piece of text. So if you open up Adminer or look at your database and go into the posts table and then click select data, If I go to the very last page and click edit on my most recent post, and then look for the post content field, so you can see, let me zoom in a little bit. You can see WP:paragraph. That's the built-in default block type that WordPress gives to us for just a standard paragraph. But if we scroll down a little bit, here we can see WP:"our plugin / are you paying attention?" And literally the only thing getting saved into the database is just a simple piece of text. So as far as our front end is concerned, this has nothing to do with JavaScript. Now don't worry, later in this chapter we will learn how to include JavaScript on the front end of our website, but I think it's important to see this as early as possible. Ultimately, WordPress is just going to take whatever value our save method returns, and that's just getting added into the database like this. Now let's get back on track and talk about where we go from here. So back on the edit screen, we don't actually want the editor content to just be a heading level 3 with hard-coded text, right? Instead, we would want this to be dynamic and interactive, someplace where the user can type into a field or customize an option. However, in order to do that, we would need to be able to write fairly complex HTML, or at least HTML that's more complex than a single element with a single piece of content or children. And even though this create element method is the way that WordPress creates HTML from within JavaScript, no one, or practically no one, actually directly leverages it like this. Instead, in the real world, there's a syntax called JSX that looks almost identical to HTML, and it makes it very easy to spell out complex HTML interfaces from within JavaScript right here. Now, JSX is amazing. However, in order to use it, it does require a little bit of configuration or installation of development workflow tools on your computer. Now, while that can typically be complex or difficult to set up, luckily for us, the WordPress team has created an official JavaScript package called WordPress Scripts that makes the entire process 150 million% easier and simpler. So, in our very next lesson, we're going to learn how to use JSX here so that we can easily and elegantly spell out complex HTML interfaces. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn about JSX. Let's begin by making sure that we understand the problem that JSX solves. So in our previous lesson, we wrote this bit of JavaScript to create a heading level 3 with this as its content. Now, when you just need to create one single element, this code isn't too bad to type out, but in the real world, in HTML, we often need all sorts of container and wrapper divs, and then you're going to have 5 or 10 different children elements that might have nested contents of their own. In other words, spelling out a real-world HTML structure with this type of code is not enjoyable. I'm about to paste in a bit of example code, and you do not need to type this out. It's going to be an example of what we do not want to have to type out. I just want to show you, let me paste this in, that the create element function can indeed create complex nested HTML structures. It's just not enjoyable for you and I to have to manually type out. So remember, create element takes 3 arguments: the type of element you want to create, any properties or attributes describing that element, and then the third argument is the content for that element. So in this example that I just pasted in, I have a div, and then for its content, it's actually just an array of other elements. So I have a div with an h1 and an h4. You can see the h4, instead of null for the second argument, I give it a style object, and I set the color. So if I save this and reload, cool, you can see that there's a wrapper div. Well, you can't see the wrapper div, but there's a div with 2 pieces of content inside it. The color is working, perfect. Only No one wants to have to spell out HTML like this. It's not enjoyable, it's slow, inefficient, it's not intuitive. So if we can avoid this, we definitely want to. And this is where JSX comes into play. Now again, what I'm about to paste in, you do not need to type this out. This is just a quick demo. But what if instead of all of this, we could express this same HTML structure with just this? This looks almost identical to HTML. There are subtle differences, but this is very intuitive and easy for you and I to type out. So this is JSX, and it's going to make our lives so much easier. However, we can't just feed the web browser JSX directly like this. If I save this, we're going to run into all sorts of errors and problems, right? If I reload, WordPress has no idea what's going on. We see this error message, and this is because JSX in this syntax right here, this doesn't make sense to the web browser, right? The web browser speaks JavaScript. It does not speak JSX. So what we need is a tool in the middle that will take our source code and then convert it, let me Command Z, that will convert our JSX into this, and this is what will actually get fed to the web browser. Right, so essentially, you and I will get to write source code that looks like this. It can live in a folder named source, and then the automatic tool that converts this code, right, so if I put it back to this version of the file can live in a different folder called build, and that's what will tell WordPress to actually load. So right now, let me put my edit function back to the exact same way that yours is from our previous lesson. Okay, and now let's start to learn how we can use JSX. So first, we need to make sure that our computer has something called Node.js installed on it. Now, if you've watched the entirety of this course, odds are you already have Node installed on your computer. But if you've skipped ahead to this plugin development chapter, or if you're rewatching this course years later and you're on a new computer, maybe you don't have Node installed. Let me show you how you can check to see if you have Node installed. So in VS Code, on Windows you can press Control and J on your keyboard at the same time. On Mac you can press Command and J. Either way, that's going to open up your terminal or command line down here towards the bottom. Now I want you to run this command with me to see if you have Node installed. It's just Node and then a space, dash dash, so 2 dashes, version. Hit enter. If you see any sort of version number here, cool, you already have Node installed. If instead you see unknown command or command not found, you just need to go download and install Node. So you can pause the video lesson, go to the official Node website, nodejs.org. If you just Google for Node, this should be one of the first results. And then you can download either the long-term support version or the current version. You can't go wrong either way. So pause the video while your download completes. You should be able to just double-click the downloaded file, and then all of the default options are okay, so you can just click next, next, next. Once it finishes, you might need to restart your text editor or even your computer as a whole, but you'll know that everything was installed correctly if you try this command once again, node -- version, and you see a version number. Again, remember to toggle your command line in VS Code. It's Control J on Windows and Command J on Mac. Or instead of a keyboard shortcut, if you look in the VS Code View menu up at the top, you'll see an option called Terminal. That will do the same thing. So go install Node.js if you need to, but at this point in the video moving forward, I'm going to assume that everyone has Node installed. Now that we have Node, we can go ahead and set up the tool in the middle that will convert our JSX into code that looks like this. In the past, setting up an automated tool like that might have been a bit complicated, but luckily for us, there is an official WordPress JavaScript package. So it's just the @WordPress/scripts. So how do we download and use this? Well, when we installed Node on our computer, we also installed something called NPM, short for Node Package Manager. Now, before we use npm to download that WordPress scripts package, let's first sort of create a grocery list in our folder that will keep track of any JavaScript dependencies we need. To do that, I want you to run the following command with me. So it's npm space init space and then -y. Let's press enter. Okay, so that will create a package.json file that keeps track of everything we're going to install with npm. Really though, we only need to install one package right now, right? We want the @WordPress/scripts package. So type this command in with me now. npm install, and then the name of the package was @WordPress/scripts. And in 2021, this isn't 100% necessary, but if you want to, you can say --save-dev to mark it as a dev dependency. Go ahead and press enter, and now depending on the speed of your internet connection, this will take a minute or two. The official WordPress JavaScript package makes use of lots and lots of other smaller packages, so be patient, this will take a minute. Once it completes, the question becomes, how do we use it? Well, the nice thing about this package is that it requires almost zero configuration. In other words, it has a certain folder and file structure that it's going to look for. So in our plugin folder, I want you to create a new subfolder with this exact name. So new folder, it needs to be exactly src, short for source. Okay? Inside that new source folder, I want you to create a new file, and let's name it index.js. Now inside this brand new, totally blank index.js file, why don't we just copy and paste over the contents from our test.js? So open up test, just select everything in this entire file, copy it back in our new index.js file, paste it in. We can save that. We can actually go ahead and delete our test.js file. We no longer need it. Okay, now within our index.js file, let's try to use a bit of JSX. So within our edit function, what are we going to return? Let's get rid of all of this. So right now I just have a function, I'm returning nothing. What I really want to return, well, is just a bit of JSX. So let's have a heading level 3 and say this is an H3 from JSX. Let's give that a save. Okay, so now we just need a way to tell that WordPress package to convert this file for us. Here's how we do that. I want you to jump into the package.json file. We're looking for the area called scripts. Right now there's just this one test script. So maybe on a new line right above the test, let's say quotes build colon string of text wp-scripts build. So essentially we're just creating a command that we can run in the command line called build. We do want to set up one more script or command. So at the end of this line, let's add a comma. And then on a new line, let's say quotes start colon and then string of text wp-scripts start. Be sure to end that line with a comma as well. Let's go ahead and save this, and we now have everything we need. So check this out. In our command line, we can now run one of these tasks, either build or start. Start is nice because it will watch us ongoing, and every single time we save a change to one of our files, it will automatically rebundle up the converted version on the fly. So the build command, on the other hand, that just performs a one-time build. So when you're actively developing though, start is a very, very useful command. So let's do this. We just say npm run and then the name of the script or command that we're interested in, which is start. So npm run start. Go ahead and press enter. Okay, and here's where things get interesting. Notice in our folder, we didn't create this folder named build. So the WordPress JavaScript package did this for us. Inside of the build folder is a converted copy of our index.js file. Now, it's not meant to be human readable, so if you open it up, it's not the easiest thing to look through. It's optimized for a browser, not for a human to read. But if you scroll down, for me it's around line number 106. It'll probably be different for you. Or you could just press Command F or Control F and search for the text that you typed. But here you can see it automatically converted our JSX into create element, and then those are the 3 arguments again. So we don't have to ever write this unintuitive code again. We just write it the way that we want to write it in the source folder, and this automated script will do the rest for us. And because we used the start script, it's still watching us. So if I change this from a period to 2 exclamation marks and hit save, watch what happens in the command line. Well, it wasn't a huge change, but the point is it just ran again. So if you check the copy that lives in the build folder, look, it's automatically been updated. There are the 2 exclamations. So the point is, we just now want to tell, let me close this file. We just want to tell WordPress to load this version of the JavaScript file in the browser. So to do that, we would just go into our index.php file, and we're looking for our function that we named admin assets. We're just looking for the path that points towards our JavaScript file. So instead of test.js, let's hollow out these quotes. We would instead just say, go into the build folder / and load the file named index.js. Let's give this a save. And now if we refresh the post editor screen in WordPress, awesome. This is a H3 from JSX. Now that it's up and running, let's practice with more complex or nested HTML. So back in our source code, so in the source folder index.js, if you only have one single element and a single line of code, you can use this syntax. However, if you want to have multiple lines and multiple elements, we do want to return a pair of parentheses, and then inside those parentheses, now we can have multiple line HTML. Well, technically it's not HTML, it's JSX, but you get the point. So let's practice. Let's have a div. So I'll type div and then hit tab. Now your VS Code might not give you the automatic tab triggers right away. If you want to make sure that your VS Code is set up like mine and that HTML tab triggers are recognized inside of JSX, here's what you can do. There are multiple ways to set this up, but this is the simplest, and I've yet to see a single drawback or downside to it. So open up your VS Code settings. On Windows, that's Control and comma. On Mac, that's Command and comma. Okay, then I want you to click this icon right here towards the top right. So you can control all sorts of different settings and options in this file. The one that I want to draw your attention to is the one that I'm highlighting right now. So I've just set a global and permanent file association. So I'm saying that any JavaScript files should not just use the JavaScript syntax reader or interpreter, they should use JavaScript React. Now this is not a plugin, you don't need to install anything to make this work. VS Code has JavaScript React or JSX syntax built in. You just need to tell it to actually use it for JavaScript files. Cool, so with this in place, your HTML tab triggers will work inside a block of JSX. Okay, so inside our div, let's practice having multiple elements. Maybe we'll have a paragraph and just say, hello, this is a paragraph. Maybe below that, we'll have a heading level 4 that says, hi there. Now, there's more to JSX than what we've seen here, but we don't need to learn too much about JSX right here, right now. We can organically and gradually learn more about JSX as we go. For now, let's go ahead and save that. And if we reload, cool, you can see our block type is using our nested or a little bit more complex structure of HTML. Really quick, I do want to show you that if you modify what our save function returns, well, you can easily add a new instance of our block type, but watch what happens to an existing block type that's already embedded in a post. So if we make a change to our save function, so what do we want to return? Just a bit of JSX. So maybe parentheses, drop down, let's have a div. Let's actually cover a very important rule in JSX, and that is that you can only have one top level element. So if I try to have a heading level 3 here and then below that a heading level 5, this will not work. This is not valid JSX. In JSX, there can only be one sort of top level or root level element. Now this doesn't mean that you have to have a semantically meaningless div wrapper. Instead, you can use something called a React fragment. So we could open this up with this symbol, just sort of an empty opening tag, and then you can have a closing wrapping fragment tag. So this is indeed valid JSX. Let me change what the actual text here is. If we save that, now because we already have this block, which is an instance of the block we're working on, if we refresh, WordPress says, uh-oh, no way. This block contains unexpected or invalid content. This is totally normal and to be expected, and we'll learn more about why this is happening and how to avoid this issue in a future lesson. For now, though, you can just click on that block and delete it. And then you can always just insert a new copy of the block. Cool. So if we click update, and then if we view that post on the front end, perfect, H3 and H5 on the front end. And that is going to bring this lesson to a close. Let's talk about where we go from here though. So we don't actually want to create these hard-coded pieces of content in our block type, right? Instead, we would want something interactive like a text field where the user can type into it. And more importantly, we would want to learn how to store the values that they enter. Well, that's exactly what we're going to cover in our next lesson. Really quick though, before this video closes, I do want to show you how to stop the task that's running in your command line. So back in our terminal, remember that's Control or Command J to toggle your terminal or command line. So that start command that we ran, it's going to keep running and watching you until you tell it to stop. So to tell it to stop, just click on your command line so it's focused and then press Control C. Doesn't matter if you're on Windows, Mac, or Linux, that is the keyboard shortcut command, Control C. And if you want to start it up again before we jump into the next lesson, it's just npm run start. Cool. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn about something we can add to our block type called an attribute. I think the easiest way to really understand what an attribute is to begin by trying to make our block type interactive. Let me explain. So right now, this is what our block type currently looks like on the post edit screen. You cannot click and begin typing. It's just a hard-coded paragraph and a hard-coded heading level 3. So instead of that, what we really want is a text input field where the user can actually click and then begin typing. Not only that, we want to be sure that we save and store the value that they enter. So throughout this video lesson, we're going to learn how attributes make this possible. Without further ado, let's jump into the code and change what we're outputting here. So within your source folder, jump into the index.js file. Right now we're interested in the JSX within our edit function. And just for a hypothetical example, let's imagine we want 2 input text fields. So let's get rid of the paragraph and heading level 4. Let's have one input text field. I'll say placeholder equals sky color. Below that, let's have a second input, and it can be, so placeholder for grass color. Just a quick note about JSX. Elements must either have a matching closing tag or a self-closing tag like this. So notice at the end of our input, there's a / to make this a self-closing element. If you got rid of that, this is no longer valid JSX. So just keep that in mind. Every element needs to be closed in one way or another. Anyways, let's imagine we have these 2 input fields, sky color and grass color. And then in terms of the HTML that we would actually want to save into the database and output on the front end of our website to the general public, Well, let's imagine we just want a paragraph of text. So we no longer need the wrapper if we just have a single element. So just have a single p tag. And inside it, let's say today the sky is, and then it would be blank, whatever color the user types into this field. And the grass is another blank, whatever the user types into the second field. So back to the entire point of this lesson, what is an attribute? Well, perhaps it's already starting to make sense. Essentially, we just need a way to bridge the gap between our admin editor code and our saved public output code, right? We need a way to fill in these blank values. So here's what we do. Let's scroll up. So remember when we registered our block type, we gave it a configuration object and it has these different properties of title, icon, category, edit, save. Well, let's just give it another property. The ordering doesn't matter, but maybe let's just add it after category. So right here, I'll drop down. The new property name is attributes, colon, and then we give it an object. Be sure to end this line with a comma. Okay, inside this object, you can drop down if you want to, I'm going to, and we just get to make up property names that will be our block's attributes. So I'm going to make up a name called sky color, colon, let's give it an object that describes this attribute. So I'm going to say that type is a string. You could also set this to be an array or a number or a boolean. But for now, let's just go with a string of text. Okay, and there are other properties that you can use to describe your attribute, but for now, this is all we need. The type attribute is the only required property. At the end of this line, let's add a comma, and then let's just do the same thing for grass color. So we'll create a property, grass color, colon, curly brackets. It has a type as well of string. Cool. So now we have this common ground that both the edit and save function can work with. From this point, we need to start thinking about how the React framework actually works. In other words, because we're not dealing with a traditional PHP or HTML form that fires on submit, we're instead working with real-time JavaScript. What I mean by this is, in terms of the event that we're going to listen for, we're not interested in any form being submitted. Instead, we're interested in each one of these inputs having their value changed, right? After every keystroke as the user is typing into this field, we want to update the value of that property in our attribute. So if the user types in the word blue, that's 4 characters, we would update the value of our sky color attribute 4 times after each keystroke. So here's how we do that. On this first field, let me hide the sidebar so we have more space. We give it an attribute of onChange equals, and then we don't say quotes. Instead, in JSX, when you want to do something dynamic, it's a pair of curly brackets. In this case, since it's onChange, we want to give it a function. And then the React framework will call our function every single time the value of this field changes. Now, in the real world, I would probably just spell out an ES6 arrow function or an anonymous function right inside these curly brackets. But in terms of actually learning and having the code be easily readable, why don't we create a separate function? So do this with me. Still inside our edit function, but just above the word return here, let's add a new line. And let's make up a function name. Let's say function. You could call it anything, but I'm going to call it update sky color, parentheses, curly brackets. Now that we have this function, that's what we would want to use for the onChange. So just say update sky color. We don't need parentheses after the name because you and I are not trying to call the function right here, right now. We're just giving a reference to the function and then React will call it at the appropriate time. Now, in terms of what we actually do inside the body of this function, this is where things get a bit complex. So if what we do in the next minute or two doesn't make perfect sense, that's okay, that's to be expected. React is definitely not the most intuitive framework in the world, but here's what we're going to do. In this function, we need a way to update the attributes that WordPress is keeping track of. Luckily for us, when WordPress calls our edit function, it's going to give it everything we need. It's going to pass something into our function. So on this top level edit function right here, we want to have a parameter. You can name it anything, but the industry standard is to name it props, short for properties. So WordPress will pass this into our function, and now we can use that inside our function. So inside our update sky color function, here's what we're going to do. We're going to say props, and we're going to look inside it for a WordPress function called set attributes, parentheses to actually call it. Inside the parentheses, we give it an object that WordPress will sort of merge into the attributes object. So in the curly brackets here, we would want to change the sky color attribute. So colon, and then you just give it the value that you want to set it to. So for example, blue. Only we don't want to set a hard-coded string of text here. We want to pull in or use whatever the user has typed into this text field. So this gets into the way that React and really just web browsers in general work. But essentially, when an HTML element has an event listener, well, when it runs the function that you told it to run, it's going to pass into it an argument that has all sorts of information about the event that just happened. So let me show you how we can pull in whatever the user has typed into the field right here. Within this function, update sky color, we want to be sure to include a parameter. You could name it anything, but it's common practice to name it E. It's short for event, or you could actually just type in event. And then instead of a hard-coded value of blue here, we would say event.target.value. So event contains all sorts of information about what just occurred. We can look inside it for target, which is the element that is firing the event. And then we can look inside that for the actual value. Let's go ahead and set up the same behavior for our second input field for grass color. So on that second input element, let's say on change equals curly brackets. We're going to make up a function name in just a minute. Let's call it maybe update grass color. Let's go create a function with that name. You can actually just copy and paste and duplicate these 3 lines for the update sky color function. So just paste that in, change the name to update grass color. The only difference is the attribute that we want to change. So instead of sky color, this would be grass color. Okay, we just need to take care of one more thing before we save and test this out, and that is our save function. So in terms of what we would actually want to show the public, how do we fill in these blanks? So instead of X here, this should pull in the sky color value and this the grass color value. Well, luckily for us, when WordPress actually calls or executes our function, just like the edit function above, WordPress is going to pass into it an argument. So we want to receive that argument with a parameter here. Again, remember the industry standard name is props. Okay, and then we can just use that down here. So instead of the X, what we would really want is curly brackets, right? That's how you do something dynamic within JSX. So we would just use the props and then look inside it for something called attributes, and then look inside that for the specific one we want, which is sky color. And we would just do the same thing here. So this would be grass color. So curly brackets, props dot attributes dot grass color. Let's save this file and test it out. But let me remind you, you do need to have your workflow running that we set up in the previous lesson. So in your command line, remember to open up your command line or terminal. It's Control J on Windows or Command J on Mac. We want to make sure that we have the WordPress scripts start task running. So again, that's npm run start. Cool, so that will perform a fresh build. We don't need to save the file again right now. Let's go test it out in the browser. Now, as soon as I refresh, we're going to see an error message here, and that's because the saved value has changed. So if we reload, don't be surprised when we see this block contains unexpected or invalid content. Again, we will learn about why this error message exists and how to get around this problem in our next lesson. But for this lesson, let's just go ahead and delete this instance of the block and then go ahead and insert a fresh new copy. So add block, are you paying attention? For sky color, let's say blue. For grass color, let's say green. And then let's go ahead and update or save our post and then view it on the front end. So if we scroll down, Perfect. Today the sky is blue and the grass is green. So our front end is working perfectly. However, if we go back to the edit screen and reload or refresh, notice the actual values that we just entered are not actually showing up or pre-populating the inputs. Well, don't worry, the data is still there in the database. We'll actually look at the database in just a minute or two. For now though, we just need to tell our JavaScript to actually use those as the values here. Let me show you what I mean. So if we go back into our edit function, right, for the edit property, on these same inputs where we added the onChange attribute, we just need to add a value attribute. So value equals curly brackets. And then remember the props that WordPress is going to pass into our function? We just leverage that here. So it's props dot attributes dot sky color. And we'd want to do the same thing for the second input. So you could just take this, select it all, copy that, paste it here, and just change the attribute name to grass color. Let's give that a save. And then if we refresh the admin screen, perfect. It's pre-populating with the real values. We can test this out. So if we change the sky color to gray and click update or save, you can see if I refresh the front end, yep, that change is actually taking place. And if we refresh the admin screen, yep, it's loading from the database. Speaking of the database, I think it's very important for you to see as early as possible how this is being stored. I'm referring to the user's values in the database. So let's go look right now. If you're using the local app to run WordPress locally, just click on the database tab and then click Open Adminer. In your new browser tab on the left-hand side, let's go into the Posts table. Click Select Data. Make sure you click the very last page of results. If you scroll down to the bottom, click Edit on the very final post that you see. And we're interested in this post content field. So let me zoom in here. Okay, so we've got a standard WordPress paragraph. If we scroll down, here is our custom block type. So WP, our plugin / are you paying attention? And now here's the interesting part. WordPress is storing our attributes object right here in this HTML comment, right? This is the beginning of an HTML comment. This is the end. So all of our dynamic data for this instance of the block just lives right here in the comment. I'm always perfectly happy with this approach. However, the official WordPress documentation does show you how to use something called source, which lets your saved HTML string of text be your source of truth. If you set things up like that, WordPress doesn't even need to store the object of attributes in the comment. It will just extract values from the saved text. Now, even though we're not going to use that approach in our real examples that we build out, I do want you to be aware of it. So let me show you how this would work. So first of all, if we want the saved HTML to be our source of truth, we need to make sure that the values are wrapped in unique elements that we can target. Let me show you what I mean. So back in our code, down in our save function, we would want to wrap this, so this first one, sky color, let's wrap that in a span. So opening span tag here. You can see VS Code tried to close the span tag here. We don't want that. We would want the closing tag here. And let's give it a unique class that we can target. Now in JSX, you don't just say class equals, you say class name, uppercase N equals. This is because class is a reserved word in JavaScript. So it's always class name. You can name it anything, but let's just call it sky color. And then let's do the same thing for grass color. So I'm going to wrap this opening span tag here. We don't want the closing one here. We want it after this. Let's give it a class name equals grass color. Okay, now check this out. Back up in our attributes definition. So up at the very top when we're using register block type, when we're describing sky color, after type string, let's add a comma. We want another property and say that source should equal text, comma. We want another property called selector, colon, and now you just give it a CSS-esque selector. So just dot sky color, because we gave that span element sky color. as a class, and in CSS you begin with a dot for a class selector. Okay, and then do the same thing for grass color. So give it another property, comma, source should be text, and the selector is just a CSS-like selector of dot grass color. If this doesn't make sense right now, I think it will in about 30 seconds from now when we see it in the database and I can explain things. But let's go ahead and save our file, and we will need to reinsert a new instance back in the editor, because if we refresh, because we changed the HTML structure of the saved content, it's no longer valid, so just delete this block. But let's insert a new instance of the block. Are you paying attention? Let's say the sky color is teal and the grass color is yellow. Let's go ahead and update that. And now let's go look at that in the database. So in Adminer, you'll need to go back a page, refresh, and just make sure that you are indeed editing the very last or final post. Notice there is no comment with those attributes. Instead, it's just this HTML string of text. So this still works perfectly in the admin area. If I refresh the front end, it still works perfectly there. The only difference is WordPress doesn't need to save a copy of our attributes in the comment. Instead, we're using this string of text as our source of truth, and we're extracting or pulling values out of it. Now, there's nothing wrong with this approach. I'm sure it's the correct option for certain types of plugins and block types, but personally, in my opinion, I never use this approach. We'll get into why in the very next lesson. But for now, I'm actually going to remove source and selector from my attributes definition, because I don't want my string of text to be my source of truth. I want to store my data in the comment. So I only showed you how to use source like this because I don't want to be dogmatic. I don't want to totally force my opinions on you, but I am going to remove that for now. So I'm going back to just having type as the only property for my attributes. Okay, just so we're on the same page, I'm going to save and then let you know that you will have to insert a new copy. So if you refresh, you'll need to delete that old instance, insert a new one. Let's say blue and green. Click update. Cool. Now trust me, right now I know that there's a lot of different moving pieces involved and there's plenty of room for confusion. But I think in our very next lesson, we're going to tie up a lot of loose ends and connect the dots between several different topics. To give you a bit of a hint, what if we don't want just a static string of text to be the result for our block type? What if we want to do something truly dynamic, something that needs to happen server-side with PHP? That's what we're going to cover in the next video. It should be a lot of fun. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn more about what our block outputs or saves. Let's jump right into the action. So in the last couple of lessons, we've seen that if you change the HTML structure for the save function for our block type, right? So if we go down to our save function, and if we change the HTML that gets output, so if I say today the sky is completely blank, if I save that and then refresh, we've seen that that causes a problem, right? And then you need to delete the block and then insert a fresh copy. So in this lesson, I want to explain why this is happening and how we can adjust our code so that we can make changes without this happening. However, even once we do that, we'll see that this approach of just saving a static string of text as the output for our block type, we'll see why perhaps this isn't what we want at all. So towards the end of this lesson, we'll learn how to make the output of our block truly dynamic. First, though, to start off the lesson, let's talk about why we are seeing this error message. To explain this, let's look at the database entry for this post. So here is that instance of our block type in the database. And remember, towards the end of our last lesson, we learned that if you let the saved string of text act as your source of truth, then WordPress doesn't even need to save your attributes in a comment like this. Well, even though we aren't using that approach and we do have our attributes in the comment, WordPress wants to keep that option open to us. Meaning it needs to be able to trust the saved text. Because remember, if we're using the source and selector properties to extract the values out of this string of text, Well, WordPress needs to be able to trust this text. And if we're changing the structure of this, then there's no guarantee that your selector is going to select the same value. Now, there is a way around this problem. It is possible to change your HTML structure and then have WordPress figure things out on its own. Let me show you how this would work with our code. But first, before we get into that, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's make sure we're working with a block that hasn't already ran into an error. So what I mean by that is I'm going to go into the edit screen for this post. Let's delete that, and I'm just going to make sure I have a new instance that is working. So I'll say blue, green, and save it. Okay, so now from this example, how would we be able to change the saved HTML structure without running into that error? Well, all we need to do is provide WordPress sort of a history of how this is going to change. What I mean by that is up at the top, well, it doesn't even need to be up at the top, but we just want to provide another top level property. So just like we have title and icon and category and attributes, edit, and save, we want a new top level property called deprecated. So we could, for example, add it at the very bottom. So after our save function, which is the last property, you could add a comma here. Let's add a new top level property, call it deprecated. It needs to be this exact name, colon, and then you give it an array. And what do you give it an array of? Well, objects. So for now, let's just give it one object. You can drop down. Inside this object, you just need to give it the attributes and save values and functions from the previous version. So for example, imagine I want to remove the word completely. That change alone would create the error. And imagine I also want to change it from a paragraph to maybe a heading level 3. So before we make any of those changes, we want to provide sort of a backup copy of the current working version in our deprecated object. So just take the entire save property and its value here. So just right up before the comma, copy that into your clipboard and paste it into your deprecated object. Okay, and then in the deprecated object, we also want to give it the attributes that we have. Now, to avoid duplicating and having the attributes spelled out in multiple places, you could create a variable up at the very top of this file, call it attributes, and have it equal this object and then just reference that. But for a quick solution, we don't care if there's a little bit of duplicate code. This is just an example. So you can just select the property attributes colon the value. We don't need the comma. Just copy that into your clipboard down in the deprecated object. Maybe right before save, let's paste that in. And then we actually did want a comma after that. Let me fix the indentation here a bit. Okay, so now that we have this sort of backed up or deprecated copy of the way things were, and WordPress can compare against this, we are free to make changes to the actual save version of our function. So now I can remove the word completely, and I could change this from a paragraph to a heading level 3. Okay, and if we go ahead and save this, and then refresh in the admin edit screen, perfect, we did not receive any sort of error message, and we can even change these values. And if we save or update our post and go view it on the front end, notice, cool, it's not a paragraph, it's a heading level 3, the word completely is missing, perfect. Because practice makes perfect, let's try having another new version, which will really illustrate why we had to give this an array. Right, when we said deprecated is an array of objects, well, you could just have another object in there. So before that first one, curly brackets for an object, comma before the new one. Inside this first one, you could just do the exact same thing. So if we wanted to change this again, you would just take the old copy of it and put it in this deprecated object. So you would just grab the save function, paste it in there. You would also grab your attributes, copy that. In the newest deprecated copy right above that, just paste it in. Be sure to have a comma. Let me fix the indentation a bit. Okay, now imagine if I wanted to say today the sky is absolutely blank, and maybe I want this to be a heading level 6. Give that a save back in the admin edit screen. We can refresh as many times as we want to. There's no problem. There's no error. I can set this back to blue and green. We can save it. If we view it on the front end, perfect. It's an H6 with the word absolutely. This is great. So we can make changes to the HTML structure. However, even with this in place, there's still one huge reason why I personally never create block types like this. When I say block types like this, what I mean is the official WordPress documentation considers this type of a save function that returns just a static string of text. It considers that to be sort of the default or standard way that a block type should be. And while yes, the documentation does provide an alternative that we're going to learn about in a minute or two, the fact remains that they consider this sort of the standard de facto way that a block should work. And in my personal opinion, this is borderline useless. Let me explain why. So yes, with the power of the deprecated property, we can freely make changes to the HTML structure. However, we still need to actively open the post in the admin edit screen and then actually resave or re-update it. What I mean is just creating a new version of our JavaScript file, just that action of us changing that doesn't do anything. In order for our content to actually get updated, someone needs to go edit that post and resave it. And while that might not seem like a problem hypothetically, in the real world it is. Because in the real world you might have hundreds of posts or thousands of posts. And if you've used a block type on all thousands of your posts, no one wants to have to manually resave and re-update those posts in the editor. So with a few exceptions, I do not like this type of a block. The exceptions would be if maybe you had a really simple block type and you had near 100% certainty that you would never need to change its HTML whatsoever. Then this approach would be okay. Or if your website is never going to have more than 10 or 20 posts and you wouldn't care if you had to manually resave a post, then again, this approach could work for you. But personally, the big reason I use WordPress in the first place is because it makes it easy to automatically and programmatically manage huge amounts of content, right? Hundreds or thousands of posts. So, having said all of that, I am not a big fan at all of this type of a block where what you're outputting or saving is just a static string of text that's going to get saved into the database. I only showed this to you because, again, I don't want to be totally dogmatic and force all of my opinions on you without at least first showing you sort of the standard way that WordPress works. But at this point, now that we've covered this, I do want to show you my preferred way of creating block types. It's something called a dynamic block. And really, the only difference is our save function is simply going to return null, or basically nothing. So do this with me. Your save property should just be a function that returns null. And what we're doing is we're moving the responsibility from JavaScript to PHP. This means we don't have to save some static text into the database. We can let PHP determine this value on the fly. And this will open up the door to truly powerful and flexible block types where even if you've used them in 10,000 posts, you're still free to change them and they will all be updated immediately. Now, before we jump into our PHP file, we no longer need this deprecated property, right? If we're transferring the responsibility of the output to PHP, then our JavaScript definitely doesn't need this big deprecated object or array of objects. So let's get rid of deprecated. Let's save that file. And our next step, if we scroll up to the top, remember how we registered this block type with JavaScript with this namespace and this exact name? Well, now we just want to go into our PHP and register a block type with this exact same matching name and just give it a PHP render function that's responsible for the output. So in our plugin folder, let's jump into our index.php file. And let's make a few adjustments. So we no longer just need to load a JavaScript file with this exact action hook. Instead of just loading a JS file, we now want to actually register a block type from within PHP. So we do want to use a different action hook. Let's change this, instead of onQ block editor assets, to just init. Okay, so that's going to call admin assets. Now in our admin assets function, instead of actually loading the JavaScript file directly, let's just register a script with this short name, and then we can reference it in just a moment. So what I mean by this, instead of calling the function WP onQ script, let's change this to WP register script. So this won't load a file anywhere, but now we have this name that we can reference. So now still in this function, but just right below this line, right about here, let's do this. Let's leverage a WordPress function called register underscore block underscore type. Parentheses to call it, and we're going to give it 2 arguments. The first argument needs to be, so a string of text, that exact matching namespace and block type name that we already used back in our JavaScript. So to be sure, you could actually just, back in JavaScript, copy this exact namespace / block type name, just copy that into your clipboard. Back in PHP, that is our value for the first argument. Okay? This second argument, instead of the placeholder B, is an array of options. So array, parentheses, inside there we can drop down. Let's give this array 2 items. So the first is a property with this exact name of editor underscore script. So this is just our way of telling WordPress which JavaScript file to load for this block type. So this is the name of the array item, and then equal, greater than, squished together. This will be the value. So this would just be string of text. You can see my short name for that script that we registered is our new block type. So that's what we want here. At the end of that line, comma, we want one more item in this array of options. And this is the really interesting one. It needs to be named render underscore callback. And now we just give it a function that's responsible for returning a bit of HTML, right? That the general public will see on the front end of our website. So let's say array, the first item is $this, right? We're just using the array callable syntax. And now let's make up a method name. How about we just call it the HTML? Okay, now let's just go create a function with that name, still within our class, but below this function. Let's say function the HTML, parentheses, curly brackets. Inside the body of this new function, we would just want to return, let's have a string of text, be sure to have a semicolon there, and let's just have a paragraph, so HTML, opening and closing, and let's say, today the sky is blank and the grass is blank. Only we want these to be real values. So when WordPress calls our function, it's going to pass into it everything we need. In other words, the attributes from that instance of the block, right? Whatever values the user typed in. So we want to have a parameter here to receive that. You could name it anything, but let's name it attributes. So $attributes, and now we can just use that. Now it's just a matter of making these values dynamic by looking inside the attributes. So let's do this. Let's close out the string of text here and then concatenate on something. And then after the placeholder, we would concatenate on another string of text like this. Instead of X, what we would actually want here is just $attributes. It's an array, so square brackets to look inside it. And we're interested in the item that's named, quotes, sky color. Okay, let's do the same thing for this, the grass color. So we can close out that string of text here, concatenate on something. After the X, we would concatenate on another string of text, the period for the end of the sentence, and the closing HTML tag. Instead of the actual X, what we would want is $attributes. It's an array, and we want grass color. And before we save this, just so we can make sure that it's actually working and coming from our new code, why don't we end it with 3 exclamations, just so it's obvious. Let's go ahead and save it and test it out. So back in the admin area, we will need to delete that old instance of the block because it was using the old JavaScript way. Now that we're using PHP, we will never run into that problem again though. So let's insert a new instance of it. Let's say the sky is light gray and the grass is green. Let's save that, and if we go view it on the front end, perfect. We see the 3 exclamations at the end. Now here's why this is so cool. If we make changes to this PHP function, so we could say today the sky is completely blank, and maybe instead of a paragraph, if we make it a heading level 1, and we save that, we don't even need to go back into the admin editor screen and resave the post. If we just refresh our front end, awesome. It's just immediately updated because WordPress is using our PHP function on the fly. I think the easiest way to understand what's going on is to look at the database again. If your WordPress is using post revisions, you will need to go back a page, make sure you're on the last page, and click the very last item. So now, this is all that's getting saved into the database. There is no string of text or content. It's just a comment saying which type of block type we're using, and then the object with our attribute values. That's it. Now there's pros and cons to everything, so what's the drawback of this approach? Well, perhaps it takes an extra 2 milliseconds for WordPress to run our PHP function instead of just loading a static string of text from the database. But I would argue that if you're being smart about caching on your site, that's not an issue. So long story short, I am a huge fan of this approach. Just a few quick notes before we close out this lesson. You could use the escape_HTML function to escape these dynamic values. However, it's not uncommon in the history of WordPress to give the admin owner of the site the ability to type in HTML into their edit screen. So that's your own judgment call. In this case, we don't really need the admin to be able to enter HTML into those fields, so I probably would wrap this in escape_HTML. Okay, next, I find that writing and concatenating PHP like this is super awkward. So what we can do instead is this. You can do this with me. Go ahead and completely empty out the body of this function. And instead, let's say ob_start, and then we're going to exit PHP. And then right here, we can have some HTML. And then on a new line, let's go back into PHP and return ob_get_clean, semicolon. So OB stands for output buffer. And essentially, anything that comes after this, but before this, well, that's what's going to get returned in our function. So where the X is, we can just type regular old HTML now. So maybe we want a heading level 3. And to save time, let me type this out, and you can pause the video if you want to. The point is that now instead of concatenating a long string together, we're just writing out HTML. When we want to do something dynamic, we're just dropping in to PHP. So it's up to you to use the attributes however you see fit, but if I save that and refresh the front end, it still works perfectly. And that is going to bring this lesson to a close. Now that we understand the very basics of setting up a block type, and we know how to connect the dots between JavaScript and PHP, I think we're ready to actually start building interesting block types. So let's look at a sneak peek preview of what we're going to build together. In our very next lesson, we're going to begin working on these real block types. So this is a quiz or multiple choice type of block type where you give a question, answers. That's the editor version. This is what it looks like on the front end. The user can get an answer wrong or get an answer correct. Okay, once we build that together, then we're going to work on this block type together called featured professor. So this is what the editor version looks like. You can choose any professor post type. It's going to give you a live preview. This is what it looks like on the editor side, and this is what it looks like on the front end. So it gives you a link that takes you to that professor's permalink, and then on the professor permalink, our plugin is going to look for any and all posts that are pointing towards this professor. So it's sort of a two-way example, working with metadata, creating relationships, and we're tying it all back in to the WordPress block editor. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Hello again. Hope you're enjoying the video. The next 16 lessons where we use JavaScript to build custom block types, those are only available in my full 36-hour premium WordPress development course. In the description of this video, you'll find a link to join that course at the best price. Having said that, in this YouTube video right now, I want to change gears and talk about the database side of things. So when does it make sense to use custom post types to store the data for your plugin? And when does it make sense to maybe go the extra mile and create your own custom database table? So right now, let's discuss that topic. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're starting a new chapter. So this is the third and final chapter in the plugin development section of the course, and it's all about how we should store our plugins data in the database. Now, before we go any further and start to talk about the details of what we're going to learn in this chapter, I first want to keep us grounded in real-world examples. So let me begin by showing you this. So here I have two different sites, two different tabs, and at first the two sites look identical. So this is a pet adoption page, and there are 100,000 pets in the collection of pets or the database of pets. And you can see each pet is just an item that has a name and 6 other pieces of data. Now, while both versions of the site are identical in that sense, they both have 100,000 pet records with the same properties. They're similar in that regard, but the two sites are very different in the sense that this tab is using the WordPress way of handling data, right? Which is custom post types. In WordPress, basically everything is just a post. So each pet is a post, the pet's name is the title, and then these 6 attributes, each one of these is just a piece of metadata associated to that post. So this tab is the WordPress custom post type way of doing things. This tab is using my own custom database table and my own SQL queries that I wrote. Now, at first glance on this initial page that just pulls in the first 100 pets, regardless of their species or favorite color or favorite food, you can see that the speed is very similar. So my custom database solution took a little bit less than 1/10 of a second, and the WordPress way of doing things took a little bit under 2/10 of a second. However, what if we only wanted to see pets where the species is cat and maybe their favorite color is green? So for example, if I go up into the address bar and add on $species equals cat and fave color equals green and press enter, well, you can see that the WordPress way of doing things took 1.2 seconds, but if I try this exact same search or query in my custom database solution, so if I say $species equals cat and fave color equals green, you can see it took just barely over 1/10 of a second. So it's nearly 10 times faster. So the speed difference is night and day. But before we start to learn about custom database tables, our first goal absolutely needs to be to understand why the custom database table solution is so much faster in this situation. The reason it's so important to understand why it's faster is because it's not always going to be the right choice. In fact, I would say that 9 times out of 10, using the WordPress way of handling data, so custom post types, is actually the smarter or correct choice. However, I want you to be able to identify these 1 out of 10 type of situations where your own custom table is the right choice. Because as we've seen, it can result in a site that is literally 10 times faster. So, big picture, our project for this chapter is to code the custom database table solution together. But before we get to that, our goal for this lesson is to really understand the strengths and weaknesses of storing data in posts. Now, you and I have already worked with custom post types a lot in this course. In other words, there's no point in you and I coding this custom post type version together. Instead, I want you to download the associated zip file with this lesson called petscustomposttype.zip. Technically, you don't need to do this since this lesson is just about understanding the big picture and not about actually coding yet. But a lot of people learn by doing and having a real breathing example to experiment with. So I encourage you to follow along in this lesson. But essentially, we're just going to take the finished product for the custom post type version and activate it and inspect it and analyze it and even look at the database structure so we can really start to get a feel for the strengths and weaknesses of custom post types. Because ultimately, we want to be able to make smart decisions of whether a specific plugin should use custom post types or a custom database table. There is no one-size-fits-all correct answer. Every plugin is different, and it just depends on the shape and quantity of your expected data. Having said that, let's start analyzing the custom post type finished solution. So again, I want you to download the zip file. Go ahead and extract it. So you should have Pets Custom Post Type folder. Directly inside it, you'll see a CSS file, a PHP file, and an INC folder. So we just want to move this folder into your WordPress installations plugins folder. So we're just looking for the installation folder of WordPress where you'll see WP content. If you go in there, you can go into plugins, and I'm just going to drag this new folder to live alongside the other plugins we've been creating so far. Okay, now back in this tab, I have not set up anything to do with pet adoption, so you and I are on the same page. So let's go activate that plugin we just added. So under plugins, if I scroll down through this list, for me it's towards the bottom, but I see pet adoption custom post type. So let's activate that. Okay, and then do this with me. We just want to create a page. So not a post, but a page. So add a new page and give it the exact title of pet adoption. We just want to make sure that the slug or permalink is pet-adoption. So as soon as we publish or save this page, well, if you use the view page link down here, well, thanks to that plugin we just activated, it should be using this template. So pet adoption, providing forever homes, one search at a time. Just a quick note, this example plugin I created is assuming that you're using the fictional university theme. So if you're using a different theme and this header area doesn't align perfectly, that's why. But really, that's not the topic at hand. Right now, I want to show you how we can begin to populate the pet collection with a bit of data. Because currently we have a total of 0 results. So do this with me. Let's open up that plugin folder in our text editor. So in the plugins folder, we just added Pets Custom Post Type. I'm just going to drag this into VS Code. Okay, and jump into the main PHP file, so Pets Custom Post Type.php. And if we scroll down towards the bottom, you'll see this comment. Essentially, it's just telling you that if you uncomment this line, this add action around line number 49, when you uncomment this out, then the next time you visit or refresh the admin dashboard, WordPress is going to generate 10 randomly generated pets. Now that number 10 is defined here, but let's just start with 10. So if I uncomment this, click save. Now before you do this, do not set this to a very large number if you're on a real web hosting account. If you're hosting WordPress locally on your personal development computer and you have 10 minutes to spare, sure, you can try entering a large number here. But to begin, let's just start with the default 10. And now if we go into the admin dashboard, or if you were already on the dashboard, then refresh. But since I wasn't already on the dashboard, just visiting it this one time will create those 10 pets. So you could already re-comment out this line and save it if you don't want to create more pets right now. But as soon as I look in the sidebar for pets, here we see pets with the custom pet icon. If you click on that, you will see 10 randomly generated pet posts. So for example, on this page, I could uncomment that line again. And if I click save, if I refresh the page, well, now there's 20 pets. So it's up to you how many pet records or pet posts you want to add. Again, if you set this to a very large number, your web hosting account will probably just time out your entire website. But if you're on your personal development computer, you could set this all the way up to 100,000, and you will need to wait maybe 5 or 10 or 20 minutes, and it will work. Now, obviously, WordPress is not optimized for creating 10,000 or 100,000 posts at once, so it's not going to be the fastest operation, But if you're someone who likes to have that full 100,000 example site to experiment with, then you can do that, but you don't need to. So for example, if I set this to just even 100, I'll let it load in real time. So if I go back and refresh, you can see it doesn't happen immediately. That took maybe 1 or 2 seconds, but now I have 120 pets. So let me comment out this line again. So again, it's totally up to you how many pets you want to add. But now if we view the front end of our website and at the end of the homepage URL, if we visit pet adoption, well, perfect. We see found 120 results showing the first 100, and here is the actual data. Now, as we saw at the very beginning of the video, when you're just performing a base query like this, where you're not searching for a specific species or favorite color, the WordPress way of handling data with post types is not very slow at all. And even further in defense of custom post types, even if you do want to query based on a piece of metadata, even that is not going to be slow unless you have a lot of posts and post meta. So let me explain. If we go up into the address bar and at the end say $species equals dog and visit that, cool, so you can see out of the 120 pets that I had, 6 of them are dogs. But notice that the time it took to find that is not very long, so that's not very slow. However, as you continue to add more and more pet posts, it's just going to get dramatically slower and slower. To understand why, let's go actually look at our database. If you're using the local WP app, you can just click on the current site you're running, click on the database tab, and then click Open Adminer. Just a quick note, if you have more than one WordPress site running at once, I have seen local get confused when you click Open Adminer and it will show you the database not for the current site that you think you're viewing. So if it feels like you're not looking at the correct data for your site, you might just need to stop any other currently running sites. Let's start by looking at the posts table. So in the left-hand area, click onto the post table, then click Select Data. Let's go to the very last page of results. And as you scroll through this list, if you created any decent amount of pets, you'll notice that each one of these posts is just a randomly generated pet. However, really the only piece of relevant pet data is the blog post title, right? That's their name. But as you scroll through this, you're not going to find their favorite color or their favorite food, their favorite hobby, because all of that is post meta or metadata. We need to remember that at its core, WordPress was originally just about creating blog posts. So the shape of data, or the shape of this table, is designed with blog posts in mind. If you want to store any type of information about something that isn't in the shape of a blog post, that's where you have to use post meta. And this is where we're getting into why this approach gets so slow in certain situations. So check this out. If we want to actually find any of their favorite colors or hobbies or foods, we need to go into post meta, the post meta table. If we click into that and click Select Data and go to our very last page, and if we look through this, notice we see fave food, birth year, weight, fave color, fave hobby, and then it already starts to repeat here. So there's going to be those 6 or 7 properties for each pet or for each post. Right? Notice that all of these, they have the exact same post ID. So they're all pointing towards that one pet object or pet post. But each little piece of data is its own entry, its own record or row in the database. And there are both pros and cons to this approach or to this database design. So the big advantage is that it's super flexible. This is what allows WordPress to store just about any type or shape of data we can think of while still using that rather limited post table structure. However, this flexibility comes at a price. So to understand why and when this approach becomes very slow, let's walk through 2 examples or 2 queries. So back to our site. Example number 1, let's talk about just this base query where you pull in the first 100 results. And then query number 2 that we'll review is when you're searching only for dogs, right? So based on a value from a piece of metadata. So let's start with query number 1, just this base query, right? We're saying to WordPress, just give me the first 100 pet posts. So this type of query will always be relatively fast, even if we have a lot of pet posts. This is because all WordPress has to do is look in its post database table, and if you scroll over to the right, it just looks for any post whose post type is set to pet. Now once it finds one of those pet items, well, it's going to know its post ID, and then it just needs to look in the post meta table for any entries where the post ID column has a matching post ID value. So WordPress can even index this column for this table, and that way, even if this meta table becomes very large, it's always going to be at least reasonably quick to perform this query. However, let's look at the slow query. So the query, if I go forward, where you're only looking for where species equals dog. Now, again, it's not very slow because I only have 120 pets, but what if I had 2,000 pets, 10,000 pets, 100,000 pets? Well, let's talk about what WordPress needs to do to the database in order to find this data. So now it's not just as simple as going into the post table and selecting the first 100 results where post type equals pet. Instead, now WordPress needs to look in the post meta table, and it does not just get to look for a matching post ID where that value can be indexed so it's super quick to find it. Instead, think about this. If we're only looking for dogs, sure, WordPress can index this meta key column and look for the rows where it has a value of species, and then look through all of those for ones where the value is dog, but that's still not ideal, especially when we realize how quickly this table can become absolutely huge. Think about it. For every one pet post, that's adding 6 new rows to this table. Imagine if you were working with some other type of data other than a pet post. Imagine if you were working on an e-commerce website where a product can have all sorts of information, the shipping weight, the height, the width, where it's produced, what it's made out of, who it's produced by, right? All these different things. What if every one of your posts is going to create 10, 20, or even 30 pieces of meta? And then imagine what if you're going to have 1,000 of those posts, or 10,000 of those posts, or 100,000. So you can imagine how this post meta table can get very large very quickly. Now let's truly change gears and let's contrast this approach with what our own custom database table could look like. So off camera, I just switched to the custom database solution. So you won't have this on your copy yet, but notice I have a table called pets. And if I click on that and select data, each row is a pet, and there's no need to look up data anywhere else in any other meta table. So if I scroll to the right, you can see there's a column for all of the relevant data. So now if you're only looking for animals where the species is dog, it's as simple as the database just looking in this one column, in this one table. So not only is the table way smaller, there's less items and rows to have to look through, right? Because each pet only takes up one row instead of each meta taking a row. But also now the database doesn't need to look for a specific row where meta name is species. Instead, it just needs to look in this one column. It knows exactly where to look and what to search for. And this is why, like we saw at the very start of this video, this approach can be 10 or even 20 times faster than the custom post type way. So you might be thinking, this is great. Why don't we just use our own custom database table like this for everything? The answer is because we're giving up or forfeiting so many cool free features when we use a table like this. WordPress does so many things for us, whereas if we use a table like this, we're essentially going back to the Stone Age. We need to do everything ourselves. We need to babysit every feature, every detail, and so development time is just going to be exponentially slower. For example, if you think about everything WordPress gives you with post types, it's giving you an admin interface where it's easy to perform CRUD operations. It's giving you REST API endpoints for CRUD operations. It automatically ties your posts to permission groups or permission roles. The list goes on and on. The point is that WordPress offers so many benefits when you use its post system that you should really only use a custom database table if both of the following things are true. Number one, you need to be able to query based on a piece of custom metadata. So just storing the metadata is not the problem. It's when you need to be able to search by it. But even that isn't a problem if you're only going to have maybe 100 posts or maybe 1,000 or 2,000 pets. It only becomes slow if you need to search by the meta and you anticipate your users will have lots and lots of those posts. If both of those things are true, then I do think your plugin should use its own database table. And learning how to set that up is exactly what we're going to learn about in the remainder of this chapter. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Hey, congrats on making it to the end of this ridiculously long video. The next 4 lessons where we create our own table and write a few basic SQL statements, those are only available in my 36-hour WordPress development course on Udemy. In the description of this video down below, you'll find a link to join the course at the best price. Again, thanks for watching until the very end. I hope you feel like you learned something, and take care.